Hello and welcome everyone to this stream on Charles XII, the fall of the Swedish Empire. I'm very lucky to be joined by Marcus Furius-Pertinax. Hello.
Hello, good morning, lovely to be back. And a really interesting topic we have today, right?
Yes, and just to start off with that, why is it that you, for example, you agree to come on this stream? What is your interest in this topic and why do you think people should recognize its importance?
Well, there's two factors. I think, firstly, although as a caveat to people listening, Charles XII and Sweden is hardly my wheelhouse. I mean, for those who have followed us for the couple of years we've been doing this, um, definitely much more acquainted with, say, Greco-Roman military history. Um, and also sort of the medieval period, the Crusades, Byzantine Empire, that sort of stuff. And also, you and I have touched on, say, like the Napoleon and the Bismarck, sort of era, which is a little after this. But the sort of that sort of 15th century sort of pike and shot era, which this kind of touches, this is the tail end of that sort of 30 Years' War, is something I've only more recently sort of come into contact with and read about. And as such, you don't really, in terms of the northern powers, you could consider Gustavus Adolphus as a member of that, his involvement in the 30 Years' War. You really can't get to that conversation point without touching on Sweden and talking about it and reading about it. And Charles XII really sort of embodies a sort of almost larger than life figure. His entire um, kingship essentially is centered around being at war. And I think even in the Great Northern War itself, I think he spends like one winter in quarters where he's not actively campaigning, which is an astonishing sort of thing in its own right. And the second thing too is that sort of Sweden as an individual power sort of has this time in the sun that coincides with the end of the 30 Years' War, but then as a result of the Northern War itself, it sort of has its zenith and then it sort of comes crashing down. It's a very sort of historically speaking, sort of a brief time of ascendancy. But for Sweden, it was sort of their high watermark, and sort of Sweden would be this great sort of regional power, but would never achieve that status again in the aftermath of this Northern War. And it's just a sort of interesting sort of time period for those who haven't read about it or don't know about it. Even for me, learning about it was quite interesting. And Charles himself sort of embodies an interesting kind of figure where in some ways, he's almost like sort of like a pre-Napoleon sort of some ways like a bit of a Swedish Caesar. It's sort of strange. He embodies like these kind of interesting archetypes, but sort of has his own story behind it. So I find Charles an interesting sort of historical figure as well.
Well, just to touch on a couple of points you've raised there regarding first of all, this is going to be a conversation about Charles XII himself, but also what is meant by a Swedish empire, because I'm afraid to say that for all of you Swedish nationalists who I'm sure are going to be watching the stream, uh, Fall of the Swedish Empire is really a misleading title, perhaps intentionally, because I really consider Charles XII's reign as the dispelling of Sweden's imperial mirage. I don't really believe that the Swedish Empire ever existed. And what Charles XII really represented is not so much the end of an empire, but rather the dispelling of an illusion, so to speak. But regarding, and I'll get more into that and try and convince you all of that interpretation. But just in terms of Charles XII, you mentioned Napoleon. Has it occurred to you that in terms of the aesthetics and in terms of the personification of the Soldatenkönig, that he is basically a forerunner to Frederick the Great, who is in turn a forerunner to Napoleon in terms of style of leadership? So just take, for example, I'm not sure you'll be able to get it. I should include more images on the stream, but the thumbnail includes Charles XII being taken away from his siege in Norway, back essentially to be interned because he has been killed in the line of combat. But he's wearing a typical blue and yellow coat, which is emblematic of the Caroline infantry, and it is a very simple but also a very recognizable, and at that time an iconic form of dress that effectively helped with Charles XII's own mystique in terms of building up the legend, which was, already far pronounced by, the very early stages of his reign. This great boy king defeating the armies of Russia, Denmark, and Poland, Saxony, sometimes being outnumbered 3-4 to 1, etc. But Frederick the Great very much embodies that same style, the miracles of Brandenburg, fighting against the Austrians, the French, the Russians, seemingly sort of unspeakable odds, um, that sort of thing. But also in terms of course, you recognize, Marcus, all the depictions that we have of Frederick aren't this sort of, grand, sort of megalomaniacal, narcissistic warlord. Of course, in some paintings of Napoleon, we undoubtedly have that. But again, the simple Prussian infantryman in his Prussian blue, sort of worn out coat, in the same way that Napoleon is going to use the bicorn hat, and he is going to transcend it and make it again irresistible in terms of an image associated with him. He will project himself as the emperor, but he will also project himself as the little corporal to his soldiers. So in that sense, Charles XII forms a grand trajectory of sort of European warrior sovereigns throughout the 18th century. And I apologize to all of you who sort of are sort of well versed in my overuse of analogies. Again, so I don't sound quite so pretentious. I'm basically kind of like the Darmok and Jalat at Tanagra, if you're any Star Trek fans out of there. I only understand things through metaphor and by analogy. And in terms of metaphor and analogy, this is far more than the Swedish phenomenon, as I've been getting at, because Charles XII's star and his reputation mesmerized Europe throughout much of the 18th century, even though outside of Sweden he is not as talked about, of course, as either Napoleon or Frederick the Great. But nevertheless, during the 18th century, much was written about him. And I was very much drawn to something which was actually written only 30 years after his death, a poem by Dr. Samuel Johnson, The Vanity of Human Wishes. It was actually one of the favorite poems of both Walter Scott, of Talisman fame, and T.S. Eliot. So it seems rather appropriate for English language commenters on the legacy of Charles XII to talk about a poem in English, inspired by one of the greats of not just English literature, but in terms of the formation and understanding and standardization of the English language, which Dr. Samuel Johnson undoubtedly is. But here we are, an excerpt from The Vanity of Human Wishes. On what foundation stands the warrior's pride? How just his hopes let Swedish Charles decide. A frame of adamant, a soul of fire. No dangers fright him, and no labours tire. O'er love, o'er force extends his wide domain. Unconquered lord of pleasure and of pain. No joys to him pacific sceptres yield. War sounds the trump, he rushes to the field. Behold, surrounding kings their power combine, and one capitulate and one resign. Peace courts his hand, but spread her charms in vain. Think nothing gained, he cries, till naught remain. On Moscow's walls, till Gothic standards fly, and all is mine beneath the polar sky. The march begins in military state, and nations on his eye suspended wait. Stern famine guards the solitary coast, and winter barricades the realms of frost. He comes nor want nor cold his course day. Hide blushing glory, hide Poltava's day. The vanquished hero leaves his broken bands and shews his miseries in distant lands, condemned a needy supplicant to wait, while ladies interpose and slaves debate. But did not chance at length her mend? Did not subverted empire mark his end? Did rival monarchs give the fatal wound, or hostile millions press him to the ground? His fall was destined to be a barren strand, a petty fortress and a dubious hand. He left the name at which the world grew pale, to point a moral, adorn a tale. If you actually have an understanding of the trajectory and the chronology of Charles XII, that is actually a very concise Virgilian Aeneid-esque biography and chronicle of Charles's reign, of course, referring to the coalition, referring to his defeat, and of course, ultimately referring to his ultimate legacy and the implications thereof. It's important to note that the reason that Samuel Johnson is writing about Charles the reason, the motivation, the inspiration behind the vanity of human wishes. It was inspired by the satires of the Roman poet Juvenal. I'm not sure if you're aware of Juvenal, obviously being far more familiar than I am, Marcus, with the history of ancient Rome. But rather than satires as we would understand it, Juvenal is really making a commentary. Really, they are lamentations, lamentations of the laxing of Roman morals, the decline of pietas and romanitas,
Mm.
etc. And
The
so when
erosion
he's
of the mos maiorum, so to speak. You know.
Yes, exactly. And
Uh,
so when he's looking at when Samuel Johnson's looking to the example of Charles XII, what to learn from him, the idea of a satire become lamentations, become observation in terms of the nature of his reign and the implications of his legacy. That again is a fundamental part of him, which perhaps I'm actually more interested in terms of the actual specifics of the military history, because it's not just, of course, in England. In France, Voltaire writes extensively about Charles XII. He has his own history, the history of King Charles XII of Sweden. And Voltaire is, in many ways, he's basically a simp for Charles XII. He's a fanboy of Charles XII. He basically refers to him as having an excess of virtue and resolution of purpose. It is from Voltaire that we have the phrase attributed to Charles: "I have resolved never to start an unjust war, but only to end a legitimate one by defeating my enemies." And a wonderful poetic turn of phrase in terms of Voltaire's assessment that the sound of flying bullets was the king's music. It was his leitmotif. But of course, this is only written by near contemporaries a couple of decades after his death, even in terms of his own soldiers and their own lionization of the legacy of Charles XII. We have Grimarest in 1706. His army is his family. He cares for it, loves it, derives pleasure from it. The soldier, the officer, for his part devoted through duty and veneration, cherishes the prince, follows him, imitates him, and spills his blood with ardor and valor, convinced that whenever the conqueror wishes to strike, he must vanquish. So obviously I've read three things out there just to give a broad spectrum, both of an English contemporary perspective and a contemporary perspective, a French one, and of course a Swedish one. How does this idea of, the myth that was all created within his lifetime, and of course the subsequent sort of attempts at romanticizing the legacy of Charles XII, do you think we can learn anything from that? Do you think it provides some glimmer in terms of the actual sort of personality and the legacy of the man himself?
Certainly, it's funny after I mentioned Napoleon, you would mention Frederick the Great, because I was actually going to mention him myself, but I didn't want to get sort of too bogged down into comparison. But I think it really does act as this sort of template, as it were, for a well, obviously, in some situations, the monarchs themselves would sort of take to the field and lead their troops, as was true for Charles, as was true for Frederick, as was true for his as was true for Charles's predecessor to Gustavus Adolphus. But you even also look like the 30s War, and the fact that a number of generals who fought in that war sort of themselves faced great perils fighting alongside their men. I mean, for instance, I can't remember if it was it Tilly, or was it the one of the other great Habsburg generals who, on the cusp of victory, I can't remember which siege it was. Was on the cusp of defeating the French. Condé, I can't remember which battle it was. I think it was somewhere like in sort of Baden-Württemberg, I think, or near Alsace-Lorraine, and he sort of proclaimed the fact that he was on the cusp of victory, and a cannonball just ended his life right there and then. This is an era where there are great perils on the battlefield. This sort of this military age of sort of pike and shot, and the beginnings, the origins of sort of massed artillery, which would sort of then be later perfected by Napoleon. And the idea that I suppose poets and writers and people who would pen history at this time would actually have a reverence for these kind of leaders who would fight alongside their troops. And in the case of the monarchs who did, Gustavus Adolphus, Frederick the Great, Charles XII. I mean, later on, Napoleon would do much the same, although an emperor, less a king. But this sort of, you might say, this admirable quality, which sort of then sort of fades away in the sort of like post-Napoleonic era, certainly in the sort of like the post-Prussian era. By the time we arrive at World War I, it doesn't really happen in quite the same way. And so I think there's an obvious sort of reverence, or at least a respect for it, which is also why, sort of at the end of his career, if you want to call it that, Charles himself ended up being quite ingratiated in the Ottoman court. He was sort of greatly loved by sort of many Turks when he was in what do you call, like, in a forced exile in the Ottoman Empire, sort of after his defeat at Poltava. Also, I think it's reflective of the kind of character that these sort of soldier kings were. That they sort of almost take this sort of Caesarean or Augustine sort of notion of, they'll eat the rough bread, they'll have the soldier rations, they'll sleep in the same tents. They're willing to subject themselves to the same condition as their soldiers. And I think sort of um, writers of a certain intellectual bent do sort of respect that as an ideal, rather than sort of monarchs who sort of live amongst the opulence and are in their palaces and sort of grow fat and lazy. You have this other type of monarchical archetype that is very much embodied by use of the German word, what was it, Soldatenkönig, like the soldier king. And I think that's very much presented at the fore of those poems that you read.
Which is more appropriate because, given the nature of the Swedish Empire, German was actually the lingua franca of the empire, not Swedish. So yes, in terms of sort of building on from that, again, for people who want to read more about this, there's an English biography by Hatton. It's from 1969, but it's still the most sort of widely cited source. For Swedish, there's Liljegren's 2000 biography. For this particular stream, I'm reading a several-page excerpt by Michael Glaeser, By Defeating My Enemies, which is reasonably good. He's a historian of Tudor England, but also has an interest in this period as well. So we've talked about Charles XII, and you mentioned Napoleon, and you've also mentioned Frederick the Great, but to me, there's clearly something Charles XII lacks compared to those two leaders. Obviously, Frederick the Great won and Napoleon lost, and Napoleon and Charles XII basically have the shame of leaving both of their kingdoms weaker than they found it, despite a transitory, ephemeral sense of glory. But what
And
is it?
both having stints of exile as well.
And both
Funnily enough.
having
Yeah,
invaded Russia.
yeah, indeed.
But what is it that Charles XII lacks compared to these two men? And it is something that he lacks that I think is actually emblematic of the whole nonsense that is the whole notion of a Swedish empire. What do you think that is?
I'm not terribly sure where you're going to go with that. One thing I will actually say, in having read about his campaigns and sort of the broad history of Charles XII, is that and other generals and other leaders in history obviously have this quality, but I feel that arguably Charles XII is potentially the most stubborn monarch in all of history, the most stubborn leader in all of history. Where he, on one hand, he's adaptive and he's a fantastic improviser, and I'd sort of mentioned Caesar at the beginning of this. He actually sort of fights in quite a similar way. He's willing to to force march. He leaves his baggage train behind. He confronts a battlefield, sees the disposition of an opponent, and he is quite inventive in how he tackles them, and often bests them, even though, as you mentioned at the start of the stream, he was often outnumbered. I think in almost all cases, I don't think he fought a single battle where he was he was in a position of numerical superiority. So on in that sense, he was adaptive and flexible. But if you sort of look at the general course of the war, he rarely adheres to the advice of his officers, and he sort of can't take a small win. He has to sort of roll the dice and go for, you might say, go for broke or go for total victory, whether it's against Russia, whether it's his Saxony campaign, which he's actually successful in that, as we know. But even his dealings with the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, he's trying to basically put himself in a position of complete victory, meeting all victory conditions, and eventually he just does not have the size army or the manpower, the resources to actually succeed in that task. And at no point in time does he sort of take a step back and accept a small loss. and it ends up costing him his kingdom, his empire, so to speak, and ultimately it does cost him his life. I did notice that trait, but I'd love to know what your thinking is.
The thing is, that is the dominant view. That's very much the prevailing view, is that it's Charles XII's again, as Voltaire says, the resolution to defeat my enemies is the only means to achieve victory. Yes, that is an element there. But I think it's actually something more substantial than that, which is Charles XII is a king who exemplifies and is one of the greatest tacticians in European history. But he only has a very limited conception of strategy. And I don't mean strategy simply in terms of defeating his enemies. I mean, he has no sense of grand strategy. This stream is not, as with Napoleon's stream, the grand strategy of Napoleon's empire or the grand strategy of Stalin's empire, because there is no grand strategy of the Swedish empire. He defeats his enemies, but there's no sort of firmer plan than that. There's no sort of great campaign of conquest or anything like that. The whole Swedish imperial project seems ephemeral, and that is essentially what I think speaks to the failing of Charles XII, because there is no grand strategy. There is victory, but you mentioned Napoleon. It's actually, I think, more appropriate to look at him as a Swedish Hannibal. You know how to gain victory, but you don't know how to use it. There was no
Indeed.
Carthaginian. There was
Yeah.
no Carthaginian grand strategy in the Punic War,
Hmm.
other than essentially to do what Charles XII does, which is try and detach Roman allies in southern Italy, in the same way that Charles XII tries to detach allies from Sweden and the Cossacks in Russia. So again, all of these, I hate again Darmok and Gelat, all of these metaphors and connections that are firing off. So
In some ways,
yeah,
you might say that Kiev and Taranto or Tarentum are sort of comparable in that sense. I try to detach away the allies of of the opponent, as it were.
yes, pretty
Um,
much.
yeah, interesting. It's a good comparison actually, and probably not one that's too far astray. I would say personally, I mean, not to get too caught up in an allegory, but I dare say that probably Hannibal had a better notion of what his ultimate objective was, but I know exactly what you mean in terms of he knows how to gain victory, but not to use it. And I really feel that once I think I'm just trying to think of the battle that was sort of a bit of a turning point. Was it around because there's a couple of like small um, uh, Swedish contingents that get defeated sort of in eastern Poland, and when the Russians start pushing into Livonia and Estonia, where they, for example, they take Narva, they sort of occupy Ingria. This is the Russians, obviously, and you can tell the inertia of the war is starting to go against Charles XII and the Swedish the Swedish forces. Another battle that comes to mind is the Battle of Kalitz in eastern Poland there, which is really the first sort of major defeat that they experience in the field. And rather than sort of consolidating and trying to sort of bring his forces together and maintain like a stranglehold over these valuable possessions, he instead is marching to Grodno. He's marching towards Minsk. He's trying to knock Russia out of the war, and then eventually he finds himself, at the very end down in Poltava. Poltava is nowhere near the defensible territories of his kingdom, of his holdings, and the force that he ends up with towards the end of the entirety of the Northern War is a very scant skeleton remnant of what was once a relatively powerful army. And probably with the exception, I mean, he did have a number of talented generals, to his great fortune. But I mean, Charles couldn't be everywhere at once. And aside from a couple of his subordinates, Ragsgold comes to mind as being a very adept general of his, and sort of there were others, but you kind of feel that there wasn't enough reinforcement sent to the right places, and often Charles, wherever he was with his army, they would like reinforce defeat, or they would reinforce a a disadvantageous position, rather than say reinforcing Ingria, rather than reinforcing Karelia or Livonia, and rather than supplying garrisons, all these small little forces that would eventually be picked off by Peter the Great and Augustus of Saxony ended up inflicting just sort of like a gradual attrition of losses that Charles could never afford, and he could never identify that as a problem. And that for me was obvious in reading about the campaigns.
Yes, in Poltava, Leeuwenhoek is often sort of the scapegoat for the defeat, and there is again this almost desperation to defend Charles XII from the mistakes of his insubordinates, etc. Just one last point, because it's been a quite long introduction, but I think it's been very informative for people completely unfamiliar with this, which is again something. It's actually a comment that you made on one of these videos a long time ago, but I don't want too much to go into it too much because I think it will become more in evidence as we get towards the end of the
Oh God,
stream.
what have I done?
Which is why I don't want to preempt you now.
Yes, yes, yes,
I
yes.
just want the idea to percolate, which is I also look at Charles XII in terms of another connection as a Heraclius figure, based on what you said, as in a man who effectively, had he lived a little longer, he could have been able to effect a change in the scenario because, as with Charles, there were great victories and there were almost apocalyptic defeats. And then there was on the cusp, as with his, I think, potential restoration of Egypt, and then he died at the wrong time. In that case, you can almost again compare that to Norway. I just want that idea to sort of percolate the fact that there is this narrative about him being responsible for the end of absolutism and him being responsible for the end of the Great Northern War and him being obstinate, him not being able to do diplomacy at all. I don't agree with that at all, and I hope to have a sort of more nuanced perspective on this, but hopefully it'll become more in evidence towards the end of the stream. But okay, I have this map up here, which is the quote unquote Swedish Empire, and I think someone in the chat has already mentioned that something could be lost in translation. This isn't referred to as the Swedish Empire within Swedish historiography. It's instead referred to as the Stormaktid, the great power period of Swedish history, which is perhaps more effective because Sweden was able to exert a long shadow over the rest of Europe, which is painfully obvious when you look at the ramifications of the War of Spanish Succession, which is taking part as basically the counterpart Great War with the Great Northern War. But it's also very much apparent in terms of great power politics, as in my view, being able to assert a nation's sovereignty. A nation can really only be sovereign, in my view, if it can exert great power status. It was basically the raison d'etre of Japan creating an empire, so it would never befall the same sort of uh, open door policy as that we saw in China. So that is sort of a means of being able to understand this great power period in Swedish history, because Sweden really has no right to be a great power. And I do mean that sincerely, because Sweden spent most of its history being a backwater in Europe. There's even a quote by a historian around the time of Gustav Vasa that the Sweden of the 16th century was as developed as France of the Carolingian period. It was a junior partner in the Kalmar Union. Denmark was the wealthy, dominant member of the Scandinavian kingdoms. Finland was even more backward compared to Sweden. As you can see, Finland and Sweden are actually sort of a core duo together and have been for most of their history until the 19th century. So that's one
Yeah.
element to consider. But
Mm.
there's also the other element to consider, and that the Hanseatic League dominated Baltic trade for a long period of time, unlike Sweden. It's only really when we come to the time of Charles XI and Charles XII that Sweden is able to assert itself as a naval power of note, so much to the extent that it's actually the maritime powers of the Netherlands and Britain that making treaties with Sweden in terms of combining their forces. So that's another thing to consider. So it is this backwater that almost out of nowhere, in terms of the whole sort of conception of European power politics, makes an incredibly dramatic entry into the world stage. To put this in perspective, when Gustavus Adolphus became King of Sweden in 1611, which is seen as basically the typical point of this Stormaktiden, um, uh, effectively Sweden and Finland had a population of 1.25 million people. France at this time had a population of 20 million people. England and Wales had a population of 4 million people. So again, tiny within the whole sort of grand scheme of European power politics. I mean, really, the only way that Sweden was sort of relevant during this time, during the 16th century, during the Livonian Wars, which have many parallels with the Great Northern Wars, those were the wars fought against Ivan the Terrible of Russia, is that Sweden was able to contribute to Europe vicariously by producing the dynasty which would then become the kings of Poland, the Vasa dynasty. Um, so that essentially is how Sweden was relevant up until that point. But you mentioned the 30 Years' War. The 30 Years' War, oversimplified, but it's not a 30 Years' War stream, so I will oversimplify, I'm sorry. But typically it is fought against Protestant and Protestant aligned princes, and they're sometimes not Protestant allies like France,
I was gonna say
against the,
plus France.
yes, plus France,
uh,
against the Holy Roman Empire. And it's basically, I mean, it's actually a very conservative campaign, but it's neither here nor there. The struggle at that time was contextualized wrongly as a struggle of the empire trying to impose Catholicism by force of arms among the Protestant princes in the north. And it was that moralizing zeal from the Protestant, from the Lutherans, and from the Calvinists that causes King Christian IV of Denmark, not Sweden, to make his dramatic intervention into the Holy Roman Empire. And he is completely roundly and humiliatingly sort of defeated by Wallenstein, the great imperial generalissimo. But it's in the following intervention, not the Danish intervention, but the Swedish intervention, that Gustavus Adolphus makes a grand and decisive intervention into the conflict, to the point it actually turns the tide of war against the Holy Roman Empire. And then to add to that, in 1635, France enters into the fray as well, which is effectively the death knell of this. And it's also important to note that when Gustavus Adolphus dies at the Battle of Lutzen, in the same way that I'm mentioning that Frederick the Great was inspired by Charles XII, Charles XII was obviously inspired by um, Gustavus Adolphus, and Napoleon also visited the battle site of Lutzen when he conquered Prussia in the War of the Fourth Coalition. So all of these connections here, in terms of what made Gustavus Adolphus such a formidable leader, he introduced conscription, which meant that Sweden was able to field an army that punched above its weight in terms of grand power politics. But he also was responsible for many military innovations. Again, it's revisionism has now basically understated in terms of his originality in terms of these innovations, because most of this was coming from the Netherlands. Maurice of Nassau in particular had been fighting literally an 80 years war against the Spanish Empire in order to make the Netherlands truly sovereign. But what this effectively amounts to is a strategy which is reliant on an incredibly aggressive, highly offensive, maneuverable army in terms of innovating, say, for example, with just basic things like having one horse being able to transport a piece of field artillery. This means that Sweden is able to move artillery pieces around during a battle. That may seem, ridiculous, but when we talk about the previous era, where we talk about like the bombards of the Turks or whatever, you would set up a cannon, you couldn't move it, and sometimes in the case of an Ottoman bombard, you can only fire it once a day. We're basically talking about static warfare in terms of the use of artillery pieces, but simple innovations like this, and again, looking at figures like Clausewitz and looking at Prussia, this is clearly an example of Bewegenskrieg, movement warfare. And again, movement warfare, which is very much inspired by this idea of encirclement and this idea of having to punch above one's weight, attack preemptively to offset the fact that one has severe resource and manpower limitations.
And also, you mentioned Bewegungskrieg. It's sort of that also sort of dovetails into the Prussian notion of I'm trying to think of the phraseology. I think it was Vernichtungsgedanke. It's like a annihilation warfare essentially, if I have the German correct. And that you use the maneuverability and the rapid momentum and the flexibility of these various units, whether it's cavalry, infantry, artillery, and a smaller force can overwhelm a larger force by sort of focusing its strength at one particular point or a couple of points along a battle line, and with superior training and superior sort of to use a French word, esprit de corps or elan to prevail in a particular fight against an opposing unit or an opposing enemy, and then win the battlefield and overwhelm a stronger opponent in numerical terms, and essentially get the most out of your small but effective fighting force. The Swedish army under Charles XII absolutely embodies that, very much so. Certainly in the first half of the war. Another point I just want to raise quickly as well is that what's interesting is that the way in which, because they refer to the army or the infantry under Charles XII as like Carolian infantry, and it's amazing how on one hand they sort of develop two modes or two aspects of their fighting that are very well honed. On one hand, they're very, very good marksmen, and in a number of instances where they come up against whether it's the Saxons or whether it's against the Russians in several battles, the volley fire of the Swedes is hugely accurate, considering that these are still relatively sort of unrefined firearms when you sort of compare it to like the War of Independence or even Napoleon's era. You're talking, one or two generations older, firearms. And the Carolians are famed for their accuracy and for the effectiveness of their volleys. And then secondly, and you see this in a number of battles too, where if they are faced with an overwhelming firepower of an opponent, in the case of, say, massed Russian artillery or an entrenched position where the Austrians are, because it happens in a number of battles. Fraustadt comes to mind. And there's a river crossing battle. I can't remember which one it is. It's later in the war. But the Carolians will close a distance and will, in some instances, fire a single volley or fire no volleys at all, and will simply engage essentially in like a mass charge. And because of their superior training, particularly in hand-to-hand combat, in most cases the Carolians prevail. And so this is an army that has a very sort of high fighting spirit and is very, very well trained, and in some ways offers you might say like a template for the armies that would be developed by Frederick the Great, that would be developed by Napoleon, that in some ways would be like the inspiration for the backbone of what would become the Prussian army in like the post-Napoleonic era. I sort of feel that the Swedish army does, it represents like a sort of a nexus, a seed, a genesis point for this style of fighting that becomes prevalent in these parts of Europe going forward.
With the exception of the overuse of pikes, of course.
That, of course, indeed, yes.
Which is very much a way in which Charles XII seems to be an innovator, but also a relic of a bygone period. So I've mentioned essentially the military angle, but we also have to look at in terms of the provinces that can make up this great power, Sweden. As you can see on this map, there is core Sweden at the time, which involves Finland and Sweden itself. Gustavus Adolphus, during his reign, there wasn't actually that much in terms of conquest. The sort of great conquering king was actually his successor, Charles X. But during Gustavus Adolphus's reign, at the very beginning, he was able to take over control of Ingria, and later he was able to take over control of Riga. And this is significant because this was during the reign of Tsar, if I remember correctly, and Livonia, as you can see, which is modern-day Estonia and northern Latvia. This was during the reign of Tsar Michael Romanov. The Russians have basically fought a consistent sort of series of enemies during a period known as the Time of Troubles. And Russia, during much of the 17th century, was instead focused on internal consolidation rather than outright expansion. It had tried that during the reign of Ivan the Terrible, and Ivan the Terrible had been defeated decisively in the Livonian Wars. So it was during that time that Sweden was able to exploit Russia's weakness and relative passivity by basically taking over the Baltic regions of what would later become the Russian Empire in the 18th and the 19th centuries. And that is significant because it means that Russia has no port from which to operate from the Baltic. It's basically landlocked because, of course, Arkhangelsk and the North Sea aren't really appropriate in terms of world sort of shattering trade deals and things like that. So in the way that Frederick the Great would be able to control the Polish economy after the partitions by controlling access through the Vistula, Sweden is in many ways gatekeeping Russia and its access to the Baltic Sea. So that is significant, albeit perhaps Gustavus Adolphus, because so much of his reign was focused on Germany, was not able to recognize the significance that would play nearly 100 years later. As you can see on this map, 1848, so this is during the time of Charles XII and Christina during the period of the Long Regency. Many German provinces are annexed to the Swedish Empire, the region around Verden near Bremen, Stralsund, and Swedish Pomerania. And these provinces are significant because it also buys into this other idea of what the Swedish quote unquote empire was, which is essentially an empire fought around a defensive principle. There is core Sweden, but you have all of these little enclaves around which you have Sweden's potential enemies in the form of the Austrians, in the form of the Poles, in the form of the Russians. And if that were ever to occur, if there were ever be a coalition force sort of rising against Sweden, as ultimately would occur, these little enclaves would mean that armies could be transported safely because you don't need to establish beachheads. And then you can attack your enemies with impunity. This is very much a strategy that Frederick the Great would exemplify when he would continually attack, again, Saxony to be specific. But that, if anything, actually betrays the fundamental vulnerability of Sweden, that it doesn't really have provinces other than some cities in Livonia. Rather, it has military outposts from which basically to launch preemptive strikes in order to defend the homeland. Just to look at the Swedish economy, for example, we're talking about copper and timber exports, and I've already mentioned the dominance of Baltic trade. But the province which is really essential in terms of a lifeline for a Swedish sovereign state in terms of some sort of form of early modern autarky is Livonia, because Livonia produces most of Sweden's food, most of which is important because Sweden itself is sparsely populated, as I mentioned, very large but very forested. There's very little in terms of actual sort of arable land which could be used to sustain a large population, hence why the population is so small. Indeed, in terms of Sweden being able to punch above its weight, it tends to involve artificial mechanisms like having the jus amorum, which is the favorable agreement which allows Swedish trade to bypass the Sound toll, which effectively allowed Denmark to control access to who enters the Baltic Sea and who enters the North Sea, as you can see on this map. That is very important to see. But Charles X makes a series of really quite sort of rapid conquests. You can see them in terms of the dates on this map if you look closely. 1858, 1858, Scania, Blekin, Trondelag, Bonholm. This was one of the most significant sort of conquests against Denmark. Effectively, Denmark and Sweden have been fighting, you can almost say, a war going all the way back to the Kalmar Union. It was rebellious Swedish nobles that were responsible basically for deposing the King of Denmark and electing Gustav Vasa in the early 16th century. So in the same way, you can say that Scotland and England had a centuries-long sort of animosity, albeit in this case, the powers are much more sort of evenly matched, especially as Denmark will be able to hold on to Norway. So Sweden under Gustav X is able to hold on to these provinces. But again, in terms of portraying this idea that the whole notion of empire is a mirage, the whole thing is incredibly fragile. Charles X dies. He dies prematurely, ultimately. And this, again, is something which is remarkable in terms of Sweden being able to punch above its weight, is that you have these great warrior kings, Gustavus Adolphus, Charles X, and Charles XII. But much of their reigns are, basically spent outside of Stockholm, and then they're punctuated by long periods of regency. In the case of Charles the Gustavus Adolphus, it was literally his daughter Christina, who had no interest in Sweden, decided to abdicate and become a Catholic and spend the rest of her life in Rome in terms of the interests, the self-preservation of a Swedish empire. And it's during the brief reign of Charles X that Sweden begins to exert this power throughout most of the Baltic again. But again, in terms of the limitations, the fact that there's very little in terms of consolidation, when Charles XII's father, becomes king, a group of powers under the auspices of Denmark invade Sweden for the whole point of regaining these territories you can see in green on the south, which is Scania, the Skaneland, which was traditionally part of the patrimony of Denmark. And it is during this conflict that Charles XI, he was basically allowing a regency council to rule for him. But it's the call to war which allows Charles XII's father to really take up the reins and become a responsible monarch. And he is able to win the war in Sweden, but he is not able to win the war in terms of propping up his empire within Germany. The only reason why Sweden survives this conflict in terms of most of its provinces intact is because of the good grace of Louis XIV. Louis XIV looked at Sweden and he thought, wouldn't it be great if I have this powerful military force with all of these dispensations, all of these fortresses in Germany, and they can just sortie out and sally forth and attack my enemies at whim, and all I have to do is give them vast amounts of subsidies. It's basically continuing on the relationship that they had during the 30 Years' War, this formal and then de facto alliance between France and Sweden. But Charles XI didn't appreciate this idea that he was basically a mercenary state operating for the interests of France. And so, after having survived the Scanian War, and with most of the provinces intact, despite again it very much being a Pyrrhic victory, he decides to spend the next 20 years at peace. And during this time, I think it's fair to say, and I think perhaps a lot of Swedes would agree with me here, that in terms of what he gave to Sweden, he is one of the best kings that Sweden ever had, because he looks at the example of Denmark. Denmark in 1660 had decided to do away with its powerful nobility and states and declare an absolute monarchy, which itself was inspired by the example of Louis XIV. Well, taking all of these inspirations, in 1680, Charles XI decides to become a Swedish absolute monarch. Swedish absolutism is imposed with a whole raft of, you can say, conceptual monarchical innovations. The king is there by divine right. There is nothing in terms of the constraints of old medieval monarchy in terms of impugning his power. And he is an absolute monarch because he is there to represent God, as Sweden effectively, this isn't a novel analogy, but Sweden at the time, especially during Charles XII and his piety as well as his military prowess, Sweden was basically considered a Lutheran version of the Spanish Empire in terms of its zealousness. So this whole idea of the Lutheran Christian mission of the kings of Sweden was embodied in this idea of absolutism. With this legacy of the Riksdag, the estates, they were effectively curtailed. A new meritocratic system of ranks, a table of ranks, was introduced in terms of bringing new people other than nobility having a monopoly over officers' appointments to the army. And this system was so successful, it would be the basis of the table of ranks that Peter the Great would later install for the Russian Empire some 40 years later. But most significantly, Gustavus Adolphus was in many ways the antithesis of King Charles XI, because he was focused, Gustavus Adolphus, in fighting his war in the 30 Years' War. And so he gave most of the land away to nobles in order to gain their good favor to continue on fighting. Charles XI looks at this example and says, okay, I'm going to launch a massive reduction of noble land. 80% of noble land is basically confiscated. And to make matters worse for the nobility, he looks back at the Regency Council that was convened when he was a child and says, all of you nobles were corrupt. You have to pay the Swedish state for the mismanagement occurred during the Regency Council. And just in terms of this, in terms of looking at this from a point of view of all the provinces, Livonia, I've already mentioned, was important in terms of the resources and the foodstuffs for the Swedish state. Livonia only had 1% royal crown lands in the beginning of this whole period of Swedish absolutism. By the end of this period, it had 72% royal crown lands. And that is actually part of the reason why the Russian strategy was predicated on bringing the German nobility over to actually avoid this idea of an overweening Swedish absolutism. So you have this idea of the state being reorganized and also reform of the military. This idea of Indelningsverk, the allotment system, a professional, self-reliant peasant army who will be exempted from taxes and corvée labor, whilst effectively while affecting a peace policy. And again, in terms of an analogy, you can look at this as some form of Frederick Wilhelm of Prussia, who will later be, that army will be created, that favorable situation will be created and then used to great effect by his successor, either Charles XII or Frederick the Great.
It's almost like almost in some ways like a Swedish take on what the Prussians would develop with the Landswehr. They kind of sort of set up in its own way, but having like this basis of a very easily recruitable population base that is adept and can be easily drafted into the army without being sort of economically burdened by like you say, taxation and that sort of thing. Just a quick point I want to make about Livonia as well is that because you mentioned about the crown lands and how those the beginning of this period it was like 1%, and then by the end of the war and by the time of Russian occupation or by the time the Russians came through, it was about 72. I can't remember the number you just mentioned, somewhere in the 70s. And it was also that also obviously coincides with a disempowering of the local nobility, which I think from what I remember reading, the nobles were reduced to about a fifth of their original holdings. So there was a massive transfer of estates and land from local nobles to the Swedish crown, which in many ways made the occupation or the continued occupation of Livonia on the back of Swedish defeat almost impossible. That they had burnt up all the goodwill that they would have otherwise had in Livonia, and for the Livonian, the sort of the partially sort of Germanicized nobility of the area were in some ways almost more than happy to see that region or those parts of the Swedish Empire just be occupied by Russia. In some ways, Peter the Great was less of a less despotic than Charles II, Charles XII in many ways. And just the last point too is that we should not underestimate or should not fail to emphasize the importance of Riga as a very valuable trading city. And in fact, Riga at the start of the war was more populous and a more valuable trading location and a more sort of valuable taxation asset than even Stockholm. It was larger than Stockholm, than Uppsala, than Skåne, than all these other cities that were in sort of territorial Sweden, more important than Helsinki and even the larger places in Finland. Riga was in many ways the jewel of the Swedish Empire, even if it wasn't this capital city. It was so important to them. And that's actually why at the sort of outbreak of the Great Northern War in 1700, why the Swedes had such a large garrison there of 4,000 or 5,000, and they resisted quite firmly and held on to Riga for a long time. It was a very, very critical and valuable part of the empire of the sort of the Swedish realm, shall I say?
Yes, and it was the prime target for Augustus of Saxony to conquer Riga, in the same way it was the prime goal of Peter the Great to conquer Ingria. They both understood the significance of this land, and someone in the chat is already mentioning that again. It was a main source of the timber supply, the dependence of the Dutch maritime power in particular on Swedish timber. But I just want to get to Charles himself because we've talked about his reputation at the beginning, but of course, Charles is now the crown prince of Sweden, or the heir to the throne of Sweden. All of his other brothers, it should be mentioned, died in infancy, but Charles XII, from a very young age, is noted basically for his very aggressive personality. He has very elaborate military drills and reenactments. He has his own version of the lifeguards called the Drabants. He goes on sort of epic sort of hunting fights, and he's actually renowned for refusing to go on hunting trips with muskets, but instead with pikes for the challenge. Essentially, he fights with sticks, he fights with pitchforks, etc. And again, this reminds me of Peter the Great, and when essentially he was out of power and his sister Sophie was organizing everything. He was renowned for his epic sort of reenactments with the Preobrazhensky and the Semyonovsky regiments. But all this does is lend itself to the idea among some historians that Charles was basically a simple warmongering brute, and that really isn't the case at all. Even from from an early age, he was proficient in many languages, theology, history. He'd read the classics, he'd read about the campaigns of Caesar. And it is from the example of his father, again, that strong sense of resolve in terms of being able to remedy the mismanagement of all of his predecessors, Charles XI, that he receives that sense of duty, piety. You can almost say to a comical extreme. I mean, some again, a cheap shot is to say because he never got married, that Charles XII, well, obviously he had to be gay. But there are two things he said regarding that. And both of these come back to being a pious Lutheran and also being a soldier. One is that he believed having a wife would actually cause a loss of morale within the ranks because being married and being a soldier were basically polar opposites, and he had to share all the experiences and privations of being a soldier, in the sense that I mentioned earlier with that quote from Grimmervest that his army is his family. He really wanted to embody that in terms of basically eschewing all women. There's also a revealing quote from him, which is this idea that had he partaken of mistresses and had a wife, that his sexual desire would have essentially been consumed his personality. You can basically say that this is a man with incredibly strong discipline. And rather than basically indulge in a way that you can say his Danish contemporary was willing to do, Christian IV, it was part of basically his own sort of moral preservation that he decided to eschew all sort of sexual encounters. That doesn't, of
Mm,
course, it's a very strict personality, but
mm.
that doesn't lend itself to the interpretation that he was obviously gay.
Exactly, and also it lends itself to like a sincere sense of you might say like personal rectitude and what was it like almost like an austerity in that he did, because I sort of mentioned this earlier, is that he sort of for the most part eschewed material sort of ostentatiousness and opulence, and he very much endured the hardships that his men went through. And if you look throughout the ages and you sort of look at the great leaders of military history, um, for the most part, where there have been successful generals who have fought alongside their men, at least in the presence of their men, and if not as a way of life in its totality, many of the best leaders of world history have echoed that sort of notion of enduring what the soldiers go through, marching alongside them, enduring their privations, not expecting to you know exhibit luxury in front of them. You might say it's like the difference between like the baggage train from Manzikert, of Romanus Diogenes, and the opulent baggage train and the luxuries following the army. Whereas, like someone like Caesar, for instance, although he'd be opulent back in Rome, he did march alongside his men. He ate their rations. He slept in tents, much like his men. And the fighting quality and the morale of the men is often reaffirmed and is maintained, and in some cases even enhanced by knowing that their leaders and their general, their ultimate leader, is willing to suffer their conditions. And I think that's something that, when you read a lot of history and a lot of military history, that theme comes up time and again, and definitely is exhibited by Charles XII. Absolutely.
So at the age of 15, his father, despite all of his achievements, dies prematurely in 1797. At the age of 15, Charles inherits Sweden. I think it's fair to say that he inherits Sweden at its strongest state relative to other European powers. And as a consequence of this idea of Swedish absolutism, Charles was the first Swedish monarch to revolutionize the coronation ceremony and crown himself. And it's interesting that from the very outset of the war, Charles abandoned Stockholm and was effectively never to return. The king almost exemplifies this return to medieval monarchy in the sense that the chancellor in the field was the de facto capital, his field government following him around, even to a much lesser extent when he was forced into his Ottoman exile in the fortress of Bender, which of course was actually referred to as Carlopolis at one point. But this meant that despite all of the logistical implications, the absolute monarchy was preserved and all foreign policy decisions were supposed to go directly through the king, even when he was ruling the kingdom from what is now modern-day Moldova, which was part of the Ottoman Empire, and even when he was basically under house arrest in Constantinople. But just to get a little bit of flavor in terms of what the Swedish army was about to embark on the Great Northern War, this is a four-page segment from Glaeser's Defeating My Enemies Alone, which is, again, based on this idea of the military reforms. In Dellingsburg, this whole idea of allotment contract, an infantryman was recruited and supported by a file or rota of two farms. He was given room and board, his uniform and kit, and a tract of land in exchange for working on the farm when off duty. When the soldier left for training or war, his wife would work in his place. For their part, the farmer and his family were exempt from service. Members of the cavalry were raised in the same way, but either the rota was larger to support the additional cost of a horse, and a man on the farm was more affluent. In one further distinction, the farm was exempt from taxation, called the Rusthal. As a result, Charles XI's modification to recruitment, Sweden's soldiers were quartered with the population at large, and their cost of upkeep was evenly distributed. There was no need, say, for example, to billet large armies, which was a major source of consternation with Louis XIV's military reforms. Per the contract, the peasant farmers and the soldiers all knew what was to be expected of them, and the crown ensured that uh, no one carried a burden unduly. The new Indelingswerk addressed the major issue of maintaining and paying for a standing army in times of peace. It was, however, meant to be a deterrent and functioned best if the war was defensive and fought on home soil. One can understand this in terms of soldiers living among the community, them finding their own, effectively no need to billet these soldiers. If the soldiers, the peasants, are part of the land, you can obviously understand why that esprit de corps and that motivation to defend would be stronger, which is arguably something lost when it comes to Charles XII. With the Great Northern War lasting 21 years and progressing deeper into the European continent, the Swedes reverted to their old tendency of war feeding war, and the system was stretched to its very limits. This, in peaceable terms, will not be so chargeable, as it is in times of war when men will be unwilling to serve and recruits more frequently needed. And as this is part of the project hitherto unexperienced, so most believe it will be found very difficult, if not impracticable. Despite the strains, the system held together, and Charles XII was able to form a new army for his Norwegian campaign of 1718. Just to put this in perspective, Charles XII assembled an army of 33,000 men in Saxony to invade Russia. In 1716, he assembled an army of 40,000 men to invade Norway. So the system was incredibly successful, despite, again, the massive, you can say, the extremities which Sweden had to experience during the war. The provincial regiments would muster annually for drill and inspection, and could be assembled within a month of receiving the order. The soldiers would leave the farms and meet to a designated point to form a small unit, or corporalskap, which consisted of 49 enlisted men and a non-commissioned officer. As it marched, the unit would link up with other ranks and would swell. 3 corporalskap became a company, 4 companies became a battalion, etc., etc. This was the standard size of 1,200 men of a regiment, and in practice the numbers varied. The Life Guard and the Nark Vamland regiments tended to be larger, while many regiments were undersized in the field due to attrition from battle or disease. For the cavalry, it was 125 horses to a company, with 8 companies forming a regiment. The tactical unit was the squadron, which consisted of 250 horses. The Swedish army as a whole was never maintained at a set size. In 1632, at the height of Gustavus Adolphus's achievements, the number was somewhere between 150,000 and 175,000 men, with a large number being mercenaries paid via the spoils of war. By 1648, it was down to 40,000. Charles X increased the numbers of his number for his wars, while Charles XI reduced the army again during peacetime. In the last year before the outbreak of the Great Northern War, the army numbered around 40,000 men, with an additional 25,000 mercenaries performing garrison duties. By the end of 1700, Charles XII had raised the numbers to 57,000 and 32,000 men respectively. Since all the conscripted men in a regiment came from the same province, and many from the same villages, it helped foster a sense of community and esprit de corps. A soldier did not wish to be found wanting in the front of his neighbours. In addition to love of home and hearth, a strong religious conviction was unanimously held through the ranks. Sweden was the Lutheran Spain, and most aspects of life fell under religious observation. Both Charles XI and XII held a firm belief that as absolute monarchs they were enacting the will of God. The devotion extended to the men under their command, who were expected to fear God and honour the king, who had entered battle with the refrain, "with God's help." And again, that just reminds me of Gott mit uns. If God is with us, who is against us? High morale was absolutely vital to the successful employment of the aggressive gapa, go on or fall on tactics favoured by the Swedes, which often required execution under withering enemy fire against a numerically superior foe. The end of the 17th century saw an advancement in military technology and a shift in tactical thinking. The cumbersome matchlock musket gave way to the flintlock. It tended to be lighter, which eliminated the need for a forked musket rest or the Swedish Schweinfeder. The drill manual from 1693 prohibited their use entirely. The number of drill steps going from matchlock to flintlock were therefore significantly reduced, which in turn increased the number of shots that could be fired per minute. The flintlock was more reliable by not requiring a lit core to be perfectly placed into an opening priming pan. This helped make up for the number of misfires, although the overall accuracy of smoothbore muskets left much to be desired. Charles XII disliked protracted firefights and preferred volleys at extremely close range to reduce inaccuracy. Alderfeld recalled the domination of Swedish arms against a unified army of Russians and Poles at the Battle of Saarland in 1703. Our fire, on the contrary, did great execution, very few shots miscarrying, and our foot having at last broke through, began to make a dreadful execution in spite of all the vigorous resistance of the Russians, who, seeing themselves pressed and lost, fought with the butt ends of their muskets, halberts, and pikes. The long pikes of our foot were now so extremely useful that the Russians, seeing themselves unable to make any longer resistance, took to their heels. The pike was a decisive weapon that bridged the transition between the Middle Ages and modernity. From the Swiss pike blocks of the Burgundian Wars to the Spanish tercios. At a time when firepower was largely unreliable and not concentrated, the pike provided a defensive picket behind which gunners could reload and avoid opposing cavalry. With the coming of the plug and the sock bayonets, the usage of pike gradually dwindled, as the musket could now serve as both the offensive and defensive weapon without a reduction in firepower. In an anachronistic quirk, both the Swedes and Russians continued to field pike during the Great Northern War, though the numbers trailed off towards the end. For the Swedes, the pike suited Garpar tactics perfectly as an offensive shock weapon. Up to 1/3 of each battalion was equipped with 3.3 to 5.6 meter long weapons, with the pikemen taking up the center of the formation. Since a typical musket was mounted with a mounted bayonet measured to around 2 meters in length, the pike enjoyed a distinct reach advantage. Following the 1 or 2 volleys from the musketeers, the entire battalion would charge with pikes leveled. So that is an important sort of and a very useful summary in terms of the tactical innovations of Sweden and why we can understand the pike being anachronistic, but nevertheless it is the sort of last golden age of the pike, which is represented in the Great Northern War. But emphasis, again, I'm sure someone in the chat is going to correct my pronunciation, but Garpar, aggression, this whole idea of being able to use basically morale shock tactics. The whole point of the campaign essentially is for the Swedes to maintain their discipline, their cohesion, and force the enemies into a withering rout, which is the strategy that Charles XII basically, I mean, if he's a tactician, a military tactician, Charles XII takes those principles and he's basically the perfect exponent of them. So go Po, apparently, according to Ivan Grozny. So yes, Marcus, any sort of comments on the tactical innovations of the Swedish army during this time?
So, more or less covered it insofar that I sort of touched on at the start of the stream, and you sort of use those couple of excerpts to sort of reinforce the point, is that we're sort of looking technologically at a sort of a midway point between what was, you know, the sort of pike and shot, the real zenith of pike and shot from the sort of 30s war and Spanish succession wars, into what will sort of later become, or what we would, you know, refer to as sort of Napoleonic warfare. You know, there is an improvement in the firearms, there's an improvement in firearm technology, there are further refinements in terms of the equipment. There's also slight changes in tactics, and despite the fact that there is a proficiency amongst the Corollian infantry as to, you know, utilizing volley fire tactics, they are still trained to be very adept in hand-to-hand fighting, whether it's with pikes or with swords. And there is very much, how can I put this? A sort of, on one hand, it's kind of like an admiration, and on the other hand, it's sort of an understanding of the utility of infantry shock tactics. I mean, we don't quite see column advances in the same way that you'd see this, say, in Napoleon's era. But there is very much a propensity of the Swedish infantry in several battles. I mentioned Fraustadt before, and I'm just trying to think of this other battle that I just can't think of it at the moment. I got a feeling it might have been. It was a battle fought, I think, around might be Grodno, where they had to cross a river and take like a redoubt, essentially, where the Russians and Austria, the Saxons, sort of place their artillery, and they will sometimes fire 2 volleys, sometimes 1. In some instances, they don't even fire a volley at all. The moment they break cover, they close the distance to get into hand-to-hand fighting. And it's a theme you see with Charles XII. And that very much embodies his sort of propensity for maneuver warfare, for swiftness of movement, for surprise, and also in some ways his adaptability, particularly in the case because often, and in almost all cases, the Swedes were outnumbered, being exposed to prolonged musket and artillery fire from the enemy would leave the Swedes in a disadvantageous position. So they would sort of embody that kind of mentality, which you've emphasized in that excerpt. Very much becomes a hallmark of how they fight the Northern War. And in many cases it works, and in some cases it doesn't. But in many cases, particularly in the first sort of half, 2/3 of the war, they make for very, very effective and successful tactics.
Just to summarize very briefly, the reason ultimately why they were successful in the early war and failed in the later war is they relied on the enemy having worse discipline than the Swedes. And especially in the case of Russia, the armies were able to reform and build up that discipline and improve their technology, improve their tactics, which effectively nullified the Swedish advantage to some extent at least. On this map, which is a map of the first stage of the Great Northern War, you can see Sweden, or southern Sweden, encircled by, well, actually here it's 4, but really we're going to talk about 3 great powers. One is Denmark, Norway in the left-hand corner. One is Poland, Lithuania, but in reality we have to be talking about Saxony, especially in terms of the early campaign, which is just below Berlin, below Prussia, Leipzig, and Dresden. And here we have Russia. One of the great what ifs, essentially, is that very early on in his reign, Charles does not take on an opportunity to marry Princess Sophia of Denmark, which is often cited as a reason why Denmark was so gung-ho about declaring war on Sweden, or getting involved in the fight with Sweden, rather to say. And this is because I've mentioned the alliance situation and how precarious the whole period of sort of isolation was. Yes, Charles XI was able to use that time, that 20-year peace, to consolidate. But when Charles XII becomes king, you have all of these ambitious sovereigns. You have the Danes, who are frustrated the fact that they had lost the provinces in the south of what is now Sweden, Skaneland. You have the Russians under Peter the Great, one of the most ambitious czars in history, who's wanting to establish ports on the Black and the Baltic Sea. And you have Augustus of Saxony, who has just been elected King of Poland and Lithuania. He's even converted to Catholicism in order to achieve that, and he's wanting to find a mechanism in order to secure that as his own hereditary possession. So all of these ambitious monarchs all converging just at a time where it seems that Sweden is weakened because the great absolute monarch has died and his young and untested son has just come to the throne. So I think it's unfair to say that Charles brought the conflict upon himself. He very much saw himself as fighting a defensive conflict effectively. And this is a way in which I'm actually going to criticize Charles XI, his father, because if you look at one of the reasons why Sweden was able to punch above its weight, and one of the reasons I believe the whole notion of a quote-unquote Swedish empire is really an illusion, basically the Wizard of Oz of historical empires, is because it relied, kind of like more primitive empires like the Mongolians, it relied on looting. Much of the reason why Gustavus Adolphus was able to continue on the conflict and hire so many mercenaries, as we saw in those eye-watering numbers, is because he looted various cities. I mean, he got as far as Bavaria in the south of Germany, but most importantly, he looted Prague, which was at that time one of the largest cities, if not the largest city within the Holy Roman Empire. What does Charles X do? Charles X spends a good several years, along with the Tsar of Russia, Tsar Alexis, looting the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. It is seen as such a traumatic moment for the Poles that they actually call this period the Deluge. It is seen as the end of Poland-Lithuania being an effective great power and the beginning of the historical trajectory towards the partitions. But what Russia does during this time is achieve something which is really rather remarkable, and it's going to allow them to achieve a lot of major gains during the course of the 18th century. And it's actually something not attributed to Peter the Great, but actually an often very overlooked period of Russian history. It was a great diplomatic success of his sister, the Regent Sophie, which was to create something called basically the eternal peace between Poland and Russia. Before then, Muscovy, Russia, and Poland had been visceral enemies. Poland had been the principal antagonist during the time of troubles. Poland had even occupied Moscow. And Russia, likewise, had been instrumental in terms of being able to dislodge a section of Cossacks and the city of Kiev away from Poland through the Treaty of Pereyaslav, and they had been instrumental in the deluge. In other words, Poland had as many historical grievances against the Russians as they did the Swedes. In fact, they had more historical grievances against Russia because Sweden at one point was actually in personal union and fought alongside the Poles in the Livonian Wars. But what happens here is that Poland-Lithuania basically forms an alliance with Russia, one that continues all the way up until Poland is basically betrayed by the Russians during the partitions. And the hostility, that hostile relationship between Poland, Lithuania, and Sweden, that lack of basically an amiable relationship, is something which damages Charles X in a way that it doesn't, say, for example, damage Peter the Great and his attempts to influence and use Poland, basically in the same way that Charles XII does, which is basically just a front in order to deflect the conflict away from his own territories. So that is important to consider as well. But in spite of all of this, there is another consideration, which is one very pissed off noble. I mentioned the reduction in Livonia. Well, a noble called Johann Patkul goes around to the courts of Europe and basically tries to foment this strategy of Augustus of Saxony invading Sweden in order to reacquire Livonia, because Patkul believes this will be a means of him getting back into power. One of the strategies in terms of why Saxony would do this and attack Riga, you mentioned, Marcus, the significance of Riga, is that Livonia was a kingdom and it was a hereditary kingdom. So if Livonia, a hereditary kingdom, could be combined to Poland-Lithuania, that could aid in this whole project of making Poland-Lithuania into potentially an absolutist state, in which case the Polish gambit would be, one of the greatest enterprises by the Wettin family in Saxony that has ever been achieved. Of course, it fails miserably, but that essentially was the goal. And of course, you have Peter the Great and his desire to establish a port on the Baltic Sea. And in order to achieve this, he actually makes peace with the Ottoman Empire in order to focus on this new embassy. Peter the Great has been traveling through Europe. He's gone to Prussia, he's gone to France, he's gone to the Netherlands, he's gone to England, and he comes back. He's made all of these alliances with these various powers, and it's first Denmark is the one to attack, and they attack because Sweden has made an ally with Holstein, basically establishing a two-front war on Denmark, and Holstein is going to be very significant when we come towards the end of this presentation. But essentially, this quote-unquote coalition between Denmark, Poland, and Russia is basically organized ineptly. Denmark attacks. Denmark does not attack in coordination with the other powers. And the best general of Charles XII, General Renskild, who you've already mentioned, masterminds an amphibious invasion of Denmark and launches a siege of Copenhagen. And what this does, within a series of months, it knocks Denmark out of the coalition in a matter, very swiftly. And Charles XII, he partakes in this, but he is not instrumental in the strategy. It is very much organized by Renskild. And really, you can say that kind of in the same way we see with, I don't know, maybe Berthier in France, it is Renskild and other generals like Eric Dahlberg who are essential in terms of providing that logistical capacity for the Swedish armies to keep on fighting. But now we come to, I think, one of many great what ifs in terms of the war. I've already mentioned the idea that part of the whole scheme of the Swedish Empire was to basically use the absolute monarchy, to use all the innovations of Charles XI to be able to fight a defensive war. And in Denmark, effectively, that had been the strategy. The war was fought. Holstein was basically now liberated, and Denmark and its plans of reacquiring territory has for now been frustrated. A short, decisive strike against the heart of Danish power in Copenhagen to knock that power out of the war. But now Charles, having taken that victory over Denmark, he arrives in Pernau in the Baltic states. And this was enough, just that one successful strike at Denmark, to induce Augustus of Saxony to abandon his siege of Riga in Livonia out of fear, and he even withdraws as far as Warsaw, the capital of Poland, Lithuania. So one decisive campaign had been enough, basically, to create this knock-on effect where the King of Poland had been enough, essentially, to abandon the conflict. Augustus, basically believing he made a mistake, appeals to Louis XIV. Like I said, Louis XIV was favorably disposed towards Sweden, and this is before the War of Spanish Succession, in which France and its capacity to mediate in conflicts is really limited. Augustus appeals to Louis XIV to make a peace. Charles potentially could have achieved a peace on the basis essentially of a status quo antebellum, and then that leaves the possibility that Russia could have too dropped out of the conflict because the coalition unraveled basically within months of its own creation. And this, again, speaks to Charles, and I think you have to give him a bit of credit here, which is Charles said that I would give Augustus peace immediately if I could trust his word. But as soon as a peace is made, and if, say, for example, this is much later in the campaign, this is during 1705, if I were to march on Moscow, he would accept Russian money, stab us in the back, and then our task would be even more difficult than it already is. So Charles recognizes the perfidious nature of Augustus, the fact that he will do or say anything and break any peace and form any alliance in order to achieve his grand ambitions of conquering Livonia. But nevertheless, he has defeated Denmark and he has forced the Polish armies away from Riga, and this allows him to focus on the Russians. Just to, obviously, I'm going to want your insights on Narva, but just to summarize very, very briefly, Charles has an army of 11,000 versus 37,000. It is his first personal victory. The Swedes lose 667 men. The Russians lose around 9,000 men besieging the Swedish fortress at Narva. In many ways, you can say when Voltaire writes about Charles, he's actually downplaying the victory, ironically, because he attributes this to the fact that the Russians were savages, but that's not true. The Russian army was an army of hardened war veterans who had just come from the Azov campaign, and they were led by a seasoned commander of the imperial wars in against the Ottoman Empire in the siege of Vienna, one French noble, Eugene de Croix. And it had been the Swedish element of surprise, the Gapau, organized in two concentrated columns to attack a widely dispersed Russian army. And to add to that, you have the benefit of a freak snowstorm that obscures the minimal size of the Swedish army and allows them to force the Russians into a complete indecisive rout. Of course, them not believing that the Swedes were capable of such an attack. And then all of a sudden, you have the Swedes basically following in the storm. A storming in terms of the actual attack, but then a literal storm in terms of the snowstorm that accompanies their advance. And it's really Narva and this mystique that allows for Charles to earn this reputation, an 18-year-old king, as some sort of military genius. But that's just a very quick summary. What do you have to say, Marcus, on Narva?
I mean, you've touched on sort of most of the key points of Narva. Pity we don't actually have a battle map here, but Narva's, like you say, it's Charles's sort of first victory at the head of an army and sort of making the calculations and determining the tactics himself. But it is actually a fantastic victory, and I think you're right in saying that the criticism of the Russians is somewhat unfair. On one hand, although other armies in the past had done this successfully, for instance, Caesar Alicia is a very famous example that most of us and our listeners would know of, where you have a contravallation and a circumvallation, and you're sort of besieging a settlement or a city or whatever, and then you're sort of fighting a relieving force from the outside, because we have to remember that you have a Swedish garrison inside Narva that has been resisting the Russian siege. The thing that does undermine the Russians is that they actually have a lot of artillery present at Narva, close to 200. I think it's around like 180, 190 pieces, but the Russians don't bring sufficient powder with them, and essentially the artillery is silent for the majority of the battle, even though so if you have like left and right flanks, because on one end, if memory serves me correct, you sort of have the Gulf of Finland, and then there's sort of like a river estuary that's on the other flank, and the Russians dig themselves in sort of like an inverted sort of crescent semicircle around the city, or the fortress of Narva, and in between the right and left flank, there's sort of like a bastion, sort of an artillery stockade that sort of separates left and right. But again, we sort of threw around a few German terms, Bewegungskrieg, Vernichtungsgedanke, these sort of, you might call them even like German sort of military philosophies that are somewhat, embodied by Charles and the way he sort of fights as a general. Another thing that you do notice is, and this occurs in a few battles, and I sort of mentioned a few of them before. The crossing, I think, of Grodno is another example of this, where they exhibit an emphasis on Schwerpunkt, focal point. And you mentioned the snowstorm, which partially, to some degree, conceals Swedish movement towards the Russian lines, but also it blinds the Russians, because it's sort of the snowstorm is in their faces, it's blowing towards them, and it really inhibits the Russians' ability to see the approaching Swedes, and they don't even really see them until they're dead in front of them, like 10, 20 paces or so, at which point the Karolian Swedish infantry has already unloaded their first volley right in the face of the Russians. But the Swedes break through just to the left and the right of each bastion, of the bastion that's in the center. And like I said to you, the Russians do have sort of a vast superiority of numbers, but they're sort of spread along. I think it ends up being like a 6 or 8 kilometer sort of set of trench works, entrenchments, and ditches. And so the Russians have to deploy the infantry all along that line, whereas the Swedes elect to basically punch in two positions either side of the bastion to break the Russian earthworks and the Russian entrenchments and the infantry that's there. And they utilize their artillery. They pulverize these 2 points. The Swedish infantry charge at them, and then they're sort of, once they turn the Russian infantry and, in hand-to-hand combat, push them back and kill a lot of the Russians in that position. The cavalry sort of stream in after them. The Swedish infantry fill in the ditches and immediately start turning the Russian flanks in an inverted sense, rather than sort of outwards in. They sort of turn them inwards outwards, because they sort of push through the earthworks and push through the middle. And then the central bastion ends up being sort of unsupported and left in isolation, which then in a night attack the Swedes take, later on, like in the dead of night, where the Russians don't even expect it. And the Swedes, despite having this numerical inferiority between superior tactics, good fortune with the weather, actually having operational artillery, which the Russians don't, and the Russians actually unable to utilize their numerical advantage of artillery, it basically performs no function in the battle itself. The Swedes win a fantastic victory, and what's quite intriguing about the aftermath of Narva is that almost all the Russian leadership or their sort of their generals are captured. You mentioned Eugene de Croix, and there's other sort of Russians as well who technically Charles de Croix was a German nobleman, from the French nobility, but
There was also
a number
there
of
was also
actual Russians.
there was also a Scottish general, one General Gordon as well. But basically, these were all
That's
sort
right,
of
yeah,
these were all basically soldiers of fortune who were seeking opportunities with
exactly. Exactly. And the kind of Westerns that Peter brought into his court, as we know, he had an extensive history of that for the entirety of his reign. Um, because also not relating to Narva, but throughout this war, there's actually a number of I think there's like a debt branch of the Bruces who end up fighting for the Russians as like captains and generals as well. But that's neither here nor there. The point is, all the other Russian generals, Golovin, Vedye, Imereti, Dolgorov are all captured, with the exception of Shemeretev, who's actually the most experienced general, but he's sort of overlooked because he's not of a sufficient rank compared to his peers, and he's the one who evacuates the siege of Narva with the Russian cavalry, which almost performs no role in the battle, but to the relief of Peter, at least the cavalry leaves Narva essentially intact, whereas the infantry are almost cut to ribbons, and with the exception of a couple of hardened regiments that were, like you said, fought in the Azov campaign, were battle hardened, and were relatively well read compared to some of the others who were less experienced, it ends up being an absolute categorical disaster for the Russians. Like you said, 700 Swedes were killed, 1,200 wounded. So you're talking like around 1,800 to 2,000 casualties. The Russians lose 8 to 9,000 killed and wounded, 20,000 surrendered. It was an absolute calamity, and because the Russians had so many artillery pieces, like I said, they had near on 200. They lost every single cannon to the hands of the Swedes. So Narva, for all intents and purposes, is a fantastic victory for Charles, and it is a calamity for Peter.
Yes, but there are two things to really consider, which is, yes, those casualty numbers look significant, but consider during the time of the Empire, there were 1.4 million Swedes and Finns during this period, and there were another 1.5 million Germans and Baltic peoples. The Russians had about 20 million people. So effectively, if we're just talking about the Swedes and the Finns, you need a kill ratio which is effectively nearly between like 15 to 1 effectively if you're going to fight a long protracted campaign, which is impossible basically to achieve. So that's one thing to consider. Despite how amazing this looks, for Sweden that's an absolute necessity in terms of the logistics of a long protracted war. But there is another element to consider, which is the Russian armies are ironically downplayed, and Charles also downplays them. And so he underestimates the Russians for the majority of his campaign, which, if anything, is his it's his fatal mistake. Because after this, he goes on and basically decides, well, the Saxons are a modern, German army. They are the main threat. So his strategy then becomes, I'm going to defeat the Saxons. Ideally, I'm going to dislodge Saxony from Poland, Lithuania. And the perfect scenario would be to win the latter, Poland, Lithuania, as an ally for any future campaign against Russia. And there was some historical precedent for this. If you look at the time of troubles, if you look at Sigismund and Ladislaus Vasa, who are Swedish, from a Swedish dynasty, and you consider effectively that when Sweden and Poland unite, that was the only time that Moscow was effectively occupied by a Western power. So there is some precedent there. But this, as I mentioned, because Russia had succeeded in diplomacy during the reign of Sophia and Charles XI had failed, this was very much an artificial contrivance. So after Narva, Charles goes and at the Battle of the Crossing of the Duna, he makes a ambitious river crossing. He is able to once again dispel the siege, the second siege of Riga, against a Saxon army which is twice the size. But a consistent theme when it comes to him fighting the Saxons is that the victory was not complete because the Saxon army is able to successfully withdraw. And then comes one of the most controversial decisions, and again, another controversial strategic decision that Charles makes. And again, part of the reason I think there was no grand strategy for Charles XII is that he decides to intervene in the politics of Poland, invading it and taking Vilnius and Warsaw after the crossing of the Duna. Why is this significant? Sweden is basically a power in personal union with Poland and Lithuania. They are separate entities. The King of Saxony, sorry, the Elector of Saxony just so happens to be the King of Poland and the Grand Duke of Lithuania. Yes, he wants to expand his power there, but they are very separate entities. And Poland and Lithuania is very decentralized. It has a very powerful nobility to such an extent that something called the liberum veto exists, whereby any Polish magnate can veto legislation proposed in the Sejm, which is the equivalent basically of the Polish parliament. So all of this is to say that you can actually say that when Charles decides to invade Poland, there is a rationale here, which is that from Poland, the Saxons are basically leading sorties and attacking Sweden. And unfortunately for Sweden, they can't retaliate because Poland and Lithuania is obviously favorably disposed towards Saxony, but is not technically a belligerent power. But when he gets involved in Polish-Lithuanian politics, when he decides to appeal to certain noble families, like I mentioned, the decentralized nature of Poland-Lithuania, and when he eventually tries to put Stanislaw Leszczynski on the throne of Sweden, then you enter into the strange implication where it's almost like Napoleon invading Spain in order to attack Portugal, because Napoleon basically does the same thing. He perhaps gets involved in the war unnecessarily. He imposes a new regime, which is basically seen to be a puppet of France or a puppet of Sweden, and it becomes bogged down into a guerrilla campaign. And it's during this time that Charles perhaps commits the most sort of egregious acts in terms of reprisals against the local Poles and the local Lithuanians. And it's also during this time that, in the same way that we have the Cossacks, who would sally forth and attack the Russians attack the Swedes and later the French in Fabian tactics. You have Polish light cavalry to such an extent that Charles XII looks at them and says, we should imitate those tactics and we should create Valak regiments of this Polish light cavalry. So, yes, he's able to win every single battle he's fighting at this time, but the strategy is confused, and ultimately, I believe it's self-defeating. Because in terms of just illustrating the effectiveness of this, his military victories, now Poland is more concentrated in their support of Augustus because Poland and Saxony are now fighting the same war. But as a result of this, you have a combined Polish army and Saxon army meeting around Krakow. And at the Battle of Klisvav, Charles defeats the combined army. But you can say in many ways, even though it's a great victory, you have Swedish losses of around 1,000 men versus 4,000 men for the Poles and the Swedes, for the Poles and the Saxons. It's part of a reckless strategy, because what is consistent about Charles and what ultimately dooms him in Russia is that in many instances, when it comes to actually launching the attack, not necessarily during the battle, but when it comes to preparing for a battle, he lacks patience and he lacks caution. And in this case, it caused him to believe that his victory was so certain he was going to attack the combined army without a full reconnoiter, without understanding the size of this army. And so it actually led to some bizarre situations in which, for example, General Renskild was operating as a cavalry force without infantry support for most of the battle. And Charles's brother-in-law, the Duke of Holstein, who was potentially be a successor to him as King of Sweden, as we would later find out, is killed during the battle. And once again, the Saxon army survives this engagement. As I mentioned in terms of the deluge and the sack of Prague, really it's the loot that is the most significant advantage from the Battle of Klisov, not the actual sort of implications in terms of the casualties and the political fallout. Because what Charles is desperately trying to do is find a legal mechanism for deposing the Elector of Saxony Augustus, a democratic mechanism, you can say. And Charles has failed to destroy the Saxon army. He's failed to destroy Augustus's position. If anything, it's becoming more secure because more Poles are looking at this as some sort of patriotic struggle to ally themselves with the Elector King of Saxony. We have another success for Charles at Pultusk, another one at Thorn. But like I said, Fabian tactics are causing Charles to have to occupy more towns and fight more battles and launch these dramatic reprisals against the civilian population. Basically, once he considered you an enemy, Charles, he would launch, all sorts of sort of brutalities against you, not to the extent of what the Russians did, but he essentially believed that once you basically had decided against him, it was your fair game, even if you were technically a civilian. He did not consider you so. And Charles was in this terrible predicament where, as you saw with Denmark, with Renskiold's masterstroke there, Denmark had been taken out by a direct strike. Charles is now realizing that his attempt to dislodge Saxony from Poland isn't going as well as would hope. In fact, it's going so badly that there is an entire coalition, a Warsaw Confederation, which is organizing for Stanislaw Legensky, but there is now a counter confederation, the so-called Sondermaris Confederation of nobles who are allied with Augustus of Saxony. So Charles thinks, okay, now the only strategy I have is to attack Saxony in the same way that I've attacked Denmark. But this is at a time where you have Bavaria allying with France against the Holy Roman Empire, against the Austrians. So what this risks, he can't attack Saxony in the way that he attacked Denmark. Why? Because an attack on Dresden could potentially risk him becoming embroiled in the War of Spanish Succession, which is being fought between France and Great Britain and Austria and Spain and all these other powers. And Sweden basically having to commit to be a hard ally of the French. And Charles XII wants that freedom of maneuver. He can't risk provoking a war with the emperor and provoking a war with the British, who are basically at this point the closest thing he has to allies, because they're the ones preventing Denmark from basically being able to launch reprisals. The idea from the British and the Dutch is to keep Denmark out of both wars now that Denmark effectively has made peace. So all of these are limiting factors. And I do think it's fair to say that he is seriously limited in his strategic options. This isn't a campaign for conquest. This is simply a campaign to secure Sweden's territory. In terms of the conquests which are afforded, there is a plan effectively to annex Courland, which is the region you can see just south of Livonia, which would now be the southern half of Latvia. But that plan really goes nowhere. And much of the strategy for Charles up until the defeat of Poltava is to get international recognition for his own puppet king, Stanislaw Legensky, to the point, essentially, that he is never recognized as an autonomous sovereign or an effective ally. In many ways, this becomes a liability, or we can almost say as the Swedish ulcer. Do you think that's fair to say?
Yeah, I think so. I sort of don't have much to add. What I will just as a reference point as well, like his attitude towards the English, the British, is that we sort of obviously started discussing the campaign of the Great Northern War, as it were. Certainly the outbreak of it by referencing his the first battle of Turning and the landing at Humberlek, which is when they sort of landed. I think it was like the main island where sort of Copenhagen is, and sort of just landed that decisive blow against Denmark early in the war. That was actually facilitated with naval assistance from the British Navy, and so you could definitely understand that Charles absolutely did not want to get them offside. And as you have rightly mentioned too, it was one of the few sort of diplomatic assets that he had on hand to sort of keep the Baltic Sea a bit of a, I don't mean to sound trite, but a Swedish Mare Nostrum, at least for the foreseeable future. Because in the end, if Sweden would be, if they were to be inhibited or interdicted from supplying their army on the continent, which is already a difficult thing for them as it was, the war would have turned, much more sour for him much more quickly, which it actually sort of didn't, certainly whilst he was campaigning in this way. But I think also too, you mentioned that he sort of bypassed Dresden. It's to some degree probably explains why he would marched on Leipzig instead. Because he on one hand he didn't want to
Well,
antagonize
well,
or
at, well, at, well,
precipitate.
at this moment, I don't want to get there quite now because he will
Okay,
effectively. But the
yeah.
reason I bring all this up is because this is to identify a failing with Charles, and the
I
reason
just
I
want to
don't.
say that I did agree with your point about not wishing to precipitate a wider war. That's what I was going to
Yeah,
say. But
yeah.
sorry, go on.
No, 'cause that I just want to hold on to that point. We'll come back to it, but it's just a little early on. We're talking about sort of 1702, 1703. The reason I point all of this out is because, I'm not a hagiographer. I have a very critical appraisal of Charles, and I'm looking at this from a point of view of a strategist. Is he fighting a war against Poland, or is he fighting a war against Saxony? The Poles themselves aren't entirely convinced. In fact, they do believe he's trying to impose a Swedish puppet on the throne. If you look at this map, you can look at Swedish Pomerania,
In
and
the
you
in the
also
form of Stanislav, correct? Yes.
Stanislav Leginsky, yeah.
Yeah.
If you look at this map,
Yeah. Yeah.
Marcus, what does Sweden have access to? It controls the mouth of the Oder, and it controls Stettin, which is a major port onto the Baltic Sea. So, in theory, given that Sweden would pursue amicable relations with Prussia, which again, you can say Prussia is one of these important powers which is now contesting with France during the War of Spanish Succession. It would suit Sweden to have amicable relations with Prussia, especially in terms of cementing their control over Poland. But wouldn't it be far more decisive, rather than attacking through Lithuania and Poland, to have attacked Saxony by asking the Prussians basically to grant them military access? If again that
You'd
was the
imagine so,
strategy.
right?
Yes, you would imagine so, but that's what I mean in terms of like what is ultimately the strategy, because it's so convoluted to get involved in Poland. You have to organize the Warsaw Confederation, a cardinal's brought in, a Swedish diplomat in the form of Arvid Horn, in order to get a coalition of nobles to support the candidacy of Stanislaw Leginsky. And like I said, all of this does is make Augustus seem more indispensable to the cause of Poland and Polish nationality, and even Lithuanian nationality as well, because the capture of Vilnius and the strategy there, and his patronage of, I think it's a family called the Sofias, who were despised by the other Lithuanian nobles. All of these, you can say, unforced errors, and his desperate plea again to get international recognition. All that does effectively, if you're going to have to enforce international recognition, there's a phrase from him: "The sword does not jest." At the point of a sword, it is temporary. You can only hold on to those vassals and those allies so long as you're victorious. But as Napoleon said, once yesterday all Europe marched with us, and now following the 1812 campaign, all Europe marches against us. This is very much the case when it comes to the situation in Poland. It is only
Yeah.
only
The
as a
vassal is only
result.
so useful insofar they can be held in line, right?
Yes, absolutely. It is only as a result of something completely out of Charles's control, which is the Battle of Blenheim, that Charles is confident enough to attack Saxony. Because with the Battle of Blenheim, Bavaria is knocked out of the War of Spanish Succession, which had been the key French ally in Germany. And that means that the imperial position is now secure, and that if Sweden were to launch an attack on Saxony, it wouldn't have the same implications in terms of being able to bleed over and combine these conflicts together. And like I said, the British and the Dutch already have an investment in keeping Sweden neutral and putting pressure on Denmark also not to get involved in one side of the conflict. So, but again, even with the situation with Blenheim, Charles is still making a very risky decision to move through, as you can see, Habsburg Silesia, not Protestant Prussia, to attack and defeat the Saxons finally 6 years into the war at the Battle of Leipzig. And it is at Altrunstadt, that you can see to the west of Leipzig, that Charles effectively wins his war, at least for now, with Saxony and with Poland. And this is another, you can say, another sort of great crossroads for Charles. He uses this opportunity, perhaps belatedly now, to strengthen relations with the new Kingdom of Prussia. He is able to secure a formal arrangement for Swedish military access, again, back through Silesia, which could allow him effectively to conduct his operations against Russia. But also you can see in terms of the significance of this territory in terms of separating Poland from Saxony. If the Habsburgs become actively hostile towards Saxony, then effectively the bridge connecting these territories is gone. But also you can say Charles XII is making errors in the sense that he demands religious toleration for the Protestants in the Habsburg Empire, within Silesia in particular. And what does this do for other European powers? It makes them think, oh, he's another Gustavus Adolphus. He's so fanatical in his Protestantism, he's going to get involved in European politics for the sake of antagonizing Catholics for the sake of propping up Protestants. Again, you can say a questionable decision given what were his ultimate sort of strategic objectives. Was he there, like Gustavus Adolphus, to intervene for the sake of Protestants, or was he there effectively to defeat Saxony? Saxony, which was a Protestant power, which just so happened to have a Catholic king, Catholic elector by some sort of grand contrivance. But what he does achieve there at Albrandstadt, which is perhaps as significant as his victory against Augustus, forcing Augustus to finally give up on his campaign, at least temporarily, to control of Poland, is he meets with Marlborough personally, the victor of Blenheim, along with Eugene of Savoy. They're actually involved in face-to-face negotiations, Marlborough having basically diplomatic carte blanche to treat with the person of Charles. And again, Charles has now already built up his reputation. He is the invincible commander. He is the victor of all these battles from Narva and now finally to Leipzig. And what is achieved here is this further agreement of this principle of non-intervention. Both powers desired to keep the conflict separate. Britain can continue its war against France and the War of Spanish Succession. Sweden can now focus all of its energies into attacking Russia. Sweden will not be there to basically be used as a French tool to which to antagonize the imperial forces, the allied forces in the War of Spanish Succession. It is during this time that Saxony orders, in Saxony, that Sweden is able to organize a fresh army, 30,000 men, 33,000 men actually, and this will be the army from which to invade Russia in 1707. So now, Marcus, this is the most important question. Why did Charles decide to invade Russia, and why did he decide to carry out in the way that he did?
Well, that's not exactly an easy question. The first part of the question is easier than the second. It is obvious that his initial intention was to, from what we can tell, march on Moscow and either bring Peter to the table or just to systemically and completely knock Russia out of the war, and therefore actually secure his holdings and his gains and to protect these sort of primitive parts of the empire, because even by the time he was sort of campaigning in Saxony and had been mired in these skirmishes all throughout the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the Russians are actually counterattacking. You can actually see from these arrows up here. They had been a second siege of Narva. They had pushed through to what is now the Estonian cities of Tartu, and I think there's another city just north of that. I've just gone. It's not Pärnu because that's on the coast there, but there's another city close to Tartu which they also take. And at this point too, they had also taken the fortress of Noterburg, which would become later the bedrock for the future St. Petersburg. So Ingria has been occupied. The Russians are making their way through the belly of Livonia into Estonia, and I would say that there's a sense of urgency within sort of Charles's mind about, and also too, another thing to sort of take into account is that, especially post the first Narva disaster, the Russian armed forces have been rebuilt to a point, or they're sort of in the midst of a reorganization and a restructuring, and the fruits of that, and that transition is beginning to bear fruit. The Russians are becoming more combat effective, and also there had been considerable measures taken to actually expand the size of the Russian force and make sure it was supplied. And this, to some degree, lends itself to why the Russians start to gain a operational advantage in this part of this theatre of the fighting. And so I would surmise that sort of Charles, while still having strong armies in the field, even though they had suffered attrition, they'd suffered losses, he still had the core of his fighting force with him. And there's this relief army coming from Sweden. He figures that this is his probably one chance and might be his last chance to definitively knock sort of like a death blow to Peter and to Russia, if not to actually occupy the country by any extent, but to at least bring them to the table and end the war. As we now know in hindsight, that really was probably not going to come to pass. but that later gets derailed by other operational choices he then makes following his march from Grodno through to Minsk and on the way to Smolensk, which he then sort of decides to not march on Moscow.
Well, there are a lot of questions you mentioned, as you can see on this map, the attack on Tartu and the creation of St. Petersburg is not just the take of Noteburg and the creation of the Schlüsselburg fortress and then the Peter and Paul fortress, etc. St. Petersburg is effectively the core, such as everything that Peter the Great's reign has been built around. It is his new capital, and he's establishing it on Swedish occupied territory. So why aren't the Swedes taking it, more seriously than perhaps they should in terms of why don't they launch a defensive campaign? Because if you look at Denmark and you look at Sweden, it's basically the same strategy. Oh, we march on Moscow to deliver a knockout blow, which forces them to, accept peace. But we're talking about Russia. We're not talking about Denmark, which you can launch a quick amphibious invasion, or Saxony, which is only actually very close to Swedish Pomerania through the Oder. You're taking the same strategy and you're trying to apply it to a country which has perhaps the greatest level of strategic depth in history. And like Napoleon, he is seeking one decisive engagement to achieve that knockout. He is not relying on the garrisons in Livonia. If anything, his army to invade Russia is effectively depleting the resources and the men that are needed in terms of holding out those territories. And again, once you have taken St. Petersburg, once you basically have, either acquired it or destroyed it, Peter the Great has lost that motivation, that reason to become embroiled in that conflict, because everything hinges around those Baltic seaports. That is your leverage in terms of being able to deny Peter those, as opposed to attacking Moscow directly. So you can understand the strategy. He's playing it out in the same way that he played out his campaigns against Denmark and Saxony. And you mentioned the trajectory he ultimately goes on. I mean, this again follows in many of the ways that he dealt with the Polish situation in terms of trying to play certain powers off each other. In the case of Moscow, this is how the situation develops. He marches towards the east, and he is able to gain in his view, it's actually his decisive victory, his most decisive victory, his favorite victory, which is at the Battle of Holovytsin, where he is able to prevent the Russian armies from combining, and he's able to defeat them decisively despite being outnumbered. And you can say that following from Holovytsin, that would be basically the tenor of the future campaign going forward into Russia. But as we see with later Russian campaigns, and as you mentioned, the potential sort of move towards Moscow, Peter the Great is not prepared to fight the campaign in the way that Charles XII is perhaps, desiring of. We've already seen Charles XII being familiar with Fabian tactics, both being applied by the Poles and also being applied in Livonia by Peter's sort of surgical strikes against important Swedish positions. He already understands, you can say, the damage that these sort of tactics can do to the Swedish army that relies on quick, decisive victories, one after another, that you would employ these Fabian tactics. And what Peter the Great does after Holovytsin is simply amp up those Fabian tactics by using scorched earth tactics to prevent the Swedes from taking the most direct route to attack Moscow. And so Charles, you can say, has a really rather novel strategy, one that in some ways confounded his generals, which was to attack in the south. And part of the reason of doing this effectively was to allow for better transportation, to carry the baggage trains forward, to keep the supply lines back to Poland going, whilst also happens to be massively overextending them by creating a very roundabout way of attacking Moscow. But again, it seemed contradictory, because you're creating a way to facilitate the passage of the baggage trains and the supply lines, but you're also attacking Ukraine because it's much more sort of arable, as much as a grand sort of agrarian province, is there to allow your armies to forage in the same way that Napoleon's armies would. So it seems to be a contradiction in why he's doing it, why he's going there. But then it transpires that the reason he's going to Ukraine, in addition to all of these other reasons, Charles XII, is to detach the Cossacks from the Russian forces under Ivan Mazepa, the hetman of the left bank Ukraine, and also to try and precipitate Ottoman invasion, an Ottoman sort of combined assault into the Russian Empire. So rather than having this decisive knockout blow, as we see with Denmark and Saxony, the Ukrainian adventure really becomes this convoluted strategy around actually appealing to diplomacy, something which Charles has been lambasted as having no capacity to engage in diplomacy. You can say diplomacy is actually his principal goal. It is to win over the Cossacks, it is to win over the Ottomans, use Ukraine basically as a supply zone from which to potentially launch an attack on Moscow. But ultimately, we don't see how that grand strategy would have ultimately played out. And also, you would have thought that Charles XII would have learned that that strategy wasn't going to be as successful as he would hoped when Peter the Great uses the Cossack defection, and he is able to get ahead of Charles. He attacks the Cossack capital at Baturin, and he massacres it. He completely levels it. He basically decimates the Cossacks, who are basically considered to be a fifth column within the Russian ranks. And at that point, 1707, 1708, Charles XII has the opportunity to say, okay, well, this strategy hasn't potentially worked. I can go out and I can defend Livonia. I can perhaps launch an attack on St. Petersburg. But instead, he continues with this incredibly flawed strategy, and that results in the disaster of Poltava. And would you like to sort of go over what really happens at Poltava, or indeed sort of review my own sort of assessment of the strategic decisions that were made to get us to Poltava?
Yeah, because it's interesting you sort of touched on Ukraine and the Cossacks, is because that was obviously one of the things that he was resting hope on. Is that at the very least, if much in the same way, in that the sort of the breakaway Poles and the Polish nobility that sort of coalesced around Stanislaw, um, he would have been hoping for some kind of uprising, or at least a break, a portion of the Cossacks breaking towards him, to at least offer, on one hand, resupply, to something of like a territorial safe haven for his army to not suffer the disastrous consequences of this vast scorched earth which the Russians, undertook, and would become a pattern for future wars. I mean, they did this in Napoleon in 1812. They would very successfully do this in the Second World War as well. So it's sort of a pattern of strategic mentality that the Russians adopt in their wars going on from this point in the future. But like you say, that the Russians launch a reprisal attack against the capital of the Cossacks. They're sort of almost terrified into rejoining the Russians in a sort of a full-throated manner, and not siding with Charles. This leaves him very isolated, a long way from home. And the other thing is you can't really talk about Poltava without sort of first mentioning the Battle of Lesnaya, because you mentioned about the 33,000 strong relief force that was sort of dispatched from Sweden to reinforce Charles's position. And Lesnaya is essentially a rearguard action that's performed by this relief army that is sort of heading towards his general direction, which is, if I believe, if memory serves me correct, was led by Lowenhaupt and Stackelberg, Otto Stackelberg. And this force, by the time it sort of gets to Lesnaya from Sweden, it's got a fighting strength of around sort of 15 to 20,000 men. And the Swedes sort of set up a series of defensive positions where sort of, they inflict gradual casualties on the Russians, they suffer some of their own, and then they end up sort of fighting. They sort of get pushed back to, because it's sort of like a confluence of these couple of rivers that sort of arrive at the actual village of Lesnaya, and the Swedes have sent their baggage train across through the village to sort of head in Charles' direction, and they sort of fight this desperate rearguard action. And sort of technically speaking, you might say that the Swedes do win this battle, and that they're successful in not being overrun, and they manage to cross with the baggage train. But sort of from a standpoint of proportion of casualties, And the Russian force that closes in on them is about 25,000 strong, and the Russians lose about twice as many men as the Swedes. But on one hand, the Russians can resupply and reinforce, the Swedes can't. And then secondly, there's sort of another approaching disaster whereby the Swedes arrive, like the surviving portion of the army arrives at the next village, which is Propoisk, which is along sort of another river that they encounter, sort of heading southeast of through Poland, and they consume what provisions they can. They send what few provisions they can across the water. They try and ford the river at some point, and then they burn or spoil what they can't carry with them. And there's a great deal of attrition that's suffered in this sort of post Lesnaya situation. In fact, even a lot of desertion. So by the time this force arrives to rendezvous with Charles, rather than being 30 odd thousand strong, he barely receives a reinforcements of barely 10,000, if not less. And much of the supply that was meant to follow this army, a scant amount of it actually reaches Charles by the very end of this trek. So you could say that for the most part, even though technically from a tactical standpoint the Russians lose the Battle of Lesnaya, for them it is a strategic victory. Charles is not properly reinforced, he's not properly resupplied, and he's still isolated down in the south, to which point then I would figure it's a fait accompli for him. So because of his situation regarding provisions and supply, he tries to take the most valuable resupply position and the largest fortress in the area, which happens to be Poltava, which brings us to essentially the siege of and then the Battle of Poltava.
But it does seem baffling, doesn't it, that after the sack of Baturin, which basically splits the Cossacks, half of them are now against you, where you thought they were all going to rise up as some sort of grand proto-Ukrainian nationalist uprising against Russia. And now you have the incredibly sort of Pyrrhic victory of Lesnaya. It's achieved its overall sort of purpose in terms of being able to get some reinforcements, but the casualties have been horrific in terms of the overall kill ratio you need to maintain in terms of being able to sustain this conflict. So Charles, again, at this point, has the opportunity to retreat, and yet he doesn't. And even you mentioned the security of the fortress of Poltava. Well, what Poltava basically does is replicate the situation at Narva, in which you now have the vulnerability of a much larger Russian force attacking a much smaller sieging Swedish force. So again, I just wonder at this point, it doesn't seem to be any strategy from Charles. It simply seems to be related to this idea that I am again, God sort of God is with us. We will continue the strategy. I am undefeated. So even though I've gone well beyond in terms of what sort of overall function this serves, I will continue on regardless. And to make matters worse, when it comes to his first defeat, he isn't actually the one leading the battle because he gets shot. He gets shot in the foot, and he's basically paralyzed for the duration of the battle. And
He
it is
ignores his
the
surgeons and then it gets infected and he's
yes, exactly, to
basically
make it
falls on a
much
litter.
worse.
Yeah.
But again, the idea that he's actually downplaying the severity and then gets affected is actually appropriate when I talk about this recklessness and this impatience. That his fundamental lack of caution is actually causing him, physical detriments in addition to the detriment of his army. But it
Yes,
is
it
the
imperils it,
general.
you could say. Mm.
Yes, it is the general, ironically, who was leading. You mentioned Steckelberg at Lesnaya, who is Lowenhaupt, who perhaps has most of the culpability or the blame for directing forces at Poltava. So, kind of like we see with Napoleon at Waterloo, not only has Charles, through his incredibly flawed strategy, arrived at the situation where Poltava didn't need to happen, but alas, here we are. But he's not even in direct command of the armies.
Yeah, indeed. And at this point too, there's something to be said for the fate of the forces at Poltava, because like as you said, it was essentially sort of uh, uh, well, Reidsgild and Lowenhaupt are sort of the two senior commanders that are sort of present in Poltava and really undertake Charles's orders to. And what's actually quite interesting is, despite the fact they were so outnumbered and there was such a disparity in terms of deployment, reserves, the supply situation, that the actual initiation of Poltava ends up being quite a success for the Swedes. They actually overrun several positions because I believe they launched their attack either around daybreak or even just before daybreak, and does catch the Russians, by surprise. But the problem is as they sort of push their position towards the actual fortress of Poltava, the Swedish forces lose their coordination, they lose their cohesion, and in part too, because I mentioned those two commanders, there is discord amongst some of the lower level command. I believe from what I remember coming across, like Schlippenbach and even Ruse were sort of in disagreement, you might say, about or rather were disenchanted about the situation, the army finding itself in a place like Poltava, and then B, disagreements about the actual strategy. So there's already this sort of lack of cohesion, lack of sort of being of one mind, as it were. Whereas the Russians knew what their overall strategy was. They knew what what they needed to do at Poltava, and what their aim was in terms of destroying or at least besting the Swedish army in a very favorable location, which Poltava was. So they initiate this attack. It's initially very successful, but the Swedes become quite disjointed and separated from one another because they're sort of in three separate fighting columns. But then eventually this attack just runs out of impetus, and what Peter has done is that he just deploys progressively stronger lines of defense, cannons and infantry, and sort of ever increasing echelons in terms of strength. And then eventually, when the Swedes overcome the last position, Peter throws open the gates of the Poltava fortress, and his infantry pour out 30,000 fresh infantry. When you consider that the Swedes have a total numerical strength of about I think the total overall strength of the Swedes is about 30,000. So you could probably presume that maybe 20 something thousand is infantry. But by the time they reach Poltava, the Swedes are absolutely exhausted. They've been fighting all morning, whereas the forces coming out of the Poltava fortress are, fresh, absolutely fresh. And Peter's there; he's leading them, and they have a very well orchestrated and a very well understood, idea for the battle, a tactic to fight against the Swedes. And eventually, by the time the Swedes arrive there, their lines are scattered. They've suffered terrible losses, and the Swedes eventually try to close in. Their volley fire just is not particularly effective. You've got to think this is an army that's been surviving on an oily rag really since the previous winter, through Poland, through Western Ukraine, and then the Russians reply with their own sort of volleys, which are devastating because in the end the Russians are fighting from some degree cover. The Swedes are out in the open, and then the Swedish infantry, the Coral infantry, does what they've always done. And we saw it at a lot of these previous battles. We saw it at Grodno, we saw it at Fraustadt, saw it at to some degree at the. I was trying to think of that crossing again. I've just gone blank. We covered it as before, but Holowitzen. That's right. His great victory. Yeah, Holowitzen. This had been successful time and time again, but on the outskirts of Poltava with his tight infantry. Men already depleted and exhausted from an entire morning's fighting, they just are eviscerated in the face of this massive fresh Russian infantry. And so by that point, Reichsguild and Lowenhaupt withdraw the Karolian cavalry, the remainder of the army. They vacate the battlefield, having watched the infantry torn to ribbons. And it is a catastrophic outcome for Charles XII and his army. Essentially, he almost has very little in the way of surviving infantry following Poltava, and the continental field army of the Swedish Empire is destroyed outside of Poltava.
And the rest of it surrenders later at the village of Perevolochna. And
Yes,
this is
exactly.
this is all significant because what you've sort of brilliantly outlined here, I look at Poltava and I basically see it as a foregone conclusion the Russians would win. It
Mm.
is so obvious that Charles had,
Almost forlorn, like from the onset, right?
yes, forlorn from the outset. It's so obvious that Charles had fallen into a Russian trap. And this is why, you know, a lot of people are, obsessed with the legacy and the brilliance of Charles XII. But I look at this and say this is why he was a great tactical mind, but he had no grand strategy, because Peter the
Mm.
Great had completely eclipsed him in terms of his own strategic understanding of the direction he wanted to take the Russian Empire. Because just look at this map. We've already mentioned the fact that he had built St. Petersburg. He had launched his raids into Livonia. The whole defensive structure of the territories that Peter actually wants to conquer, i.e., the Baltic territories of the Swedish Empire, they are now completely imperiled. And he has just lured the Swedish army, with all that sort of military glory, led by, the indomitable, Soldatenkönig, Charles XII, into a trap and destroyed its army, with Livonia and Estonia and the remains of Ingria and even Finland are now basically open for the taking. And this is a very sort of bizarre moment in history. Peter the Great has won. The Battle of Poltava is the end of the great power period of Swedish history. There's sort of no doubt about that. What essentially happens now is Sweden being able to hold on to something, rather than basically allow it to be destroyed by all of the other powers around it. But you can say again, in terms of questionable strategy, in terms of the accusation being made against Charles XII that he, is just some sort of military brute. His strategy now, in this bizarre, I don't even know how to describe it, is not really exile, but he goes over to the Ottoman Empire. He goes into a fortress known as Bender in modern day Moldavia. He basically forms his own little Swedish court there, which is nicknamed as Carlopolis. And it seems that his principal strategy is to wait for a Swedish army to arrive in what is now Romania, Moldova, to bring the Ottomans on side and to invade Russia again. That seems to be his,
And lead the grand coalition of the anti-Russian forces,
and that seems to be his strategy. But it seems he has no understand, even though we're talking about he spends 5 years, 4 to 5 years in the Ottoman Empire, and yet he seems to only have, on the one hand, he's spending all of his time politicking. He's appealing to the Grand Vizier of, Ahmed III. He's appealing to the Valid Sultan, the Queen Mother, all of these things. And he actually is able to achieve a declaration of war of the Ottoman Empire on Russia. And the Ottomans actually win. They win a battle at Pruth. But what does Peter the Great do? Peter basically bribes the Ottomans to go away and retreat. So
Mm.
this great battle at Pruth actually means nothing in the grand scheme of the Great Northern War, because Peter recovers, he bribes the Ottomans to return, he pits the whole Ottoman, the corrupt, labyrinthine, internecine Ottoman sort of system of government against each other, because the Sultan is not absolute within the
Mm.
Ottoman Empire, and he
And a vizier who's taking money from both powers.
Yes, exactly. Kind of like Augustus, as we see in
Mhm.
in Poland and Lithuania. And so Peter uses this opportunity to redouble his efforts in the Baltic. And this follows on to another bizarre, and I think this is actually a fatal strategic decision in terms of the longevity of the empire. As I mentioned, his strategy seemed determined on waiting for a Swedish, relief force, basically to meet him, basically to recreate the conditions for Poltava again, because obviously that strategy works so well in the first place when you had the experienced and victorious Swedish army, but now you're just waiting to recreate that situation, which led you to your exile in the Ottoman Empire to begin with. But as the War of the Spanish Succession is winding down, as the threat of Sweden basically still looms large over the German principalities, most notably the principalities of Hesse, of Holstein, of Hanover, and of Prussia. His diplomats, Charles's diplomats in Stockholm, proposed something called the Neutrality Convention, whereby if Sweden agrees not to dispense or dispatch forces from, as you can see, Swedish Pomerania and Verden, Bremen, Wismar, then the German principalities will not consider them as belligerent powers and will not attack them. But what Charles does is say, no, I've got to leave the option open to allow my reinforcements to come through those territories. And so what does that do? It makes them fair game for the ultimate scenario when the whole European power dynamic shifts, when the War of Spanish Succession ends. So as the whole sort of European geopolitical situation is shifting against Sweden from 1713 up until 1716, Charles is there in the Ottoman Empire still demanding money from the Ottoman court, engaging in court politics, to the point that there is even a mutiny of the Janissaries in the Ottoman Empire against Charles and his continued intrigues. It's called the Kalabalek, and it's actually entered into the Swedish language as basically a ruckus. The Janissaries storm the fortress basically of Charles at Bender, or New Bender, which was the Swedish equivalent, and Charles is forced into a situation of house arrest, and he is basically escorted by a small Ottoman entourage through Hungary back to Strasland in Germany. So you just have to look at that situation and say he could have left. He could have returned to Sweden during this time and organized the defense, perhaps try to reorganize armies to defend Livonia and try to, reconquer Finland. Because during this time, the entire eastern half of the quote unquote Swedish Empire has basically been lost to the Russians. And Charles has decided to spend this time involved in intrigues in the Ottoman Empire. It's just sort of confounding in a way, isn't it?
Yeah, it absolutely is. And it just sort of one of the things I do find perplexing is that he sort of languishes, in the Ottoman Empire for that long, where if he, not to say that he wasn't concerned for, the homeland and for the fate of his, empire, to use the term, he would have sort of gone back with a greater degree of urgency, but given the degree to which he sort of fought his battles and he sort of rigorously led his troops, all the way from Narva, all the way, to Saxony and Poltava, and sort of you could draw a triangle between those three places, and he'd sort of crisscrossed most of it. There's sort of like this passivity, sort of almost resting on a faint hope that, as we sort of just alluded to before, a reinforcing army descends, from Sweden to Romania, and the Turks, the Ottomans join in sort of this grand anti-Russian coalition, and he would march at the head of this sort of combined force and strike Moscow from its soft underbelly. It just seems extraordinarily fanciful. Even though obviously the Russians and the Ottomans have a long history of animosity with each other, and that animosity continues after this time period, it just wasn't something that was bound to really happen. You kind of get the feeling that he was very much, despite being a man that was, obviously pragmatic and stubborn, and who had endured privations and had very much had to deal with the very much the cold face of reality as a battlefield commander and as a soldier king. This sort of Ottoman era, or this Ottoman, period, he sort of almost betrays all that, and he sort of becomes a victim to flights of fancy, which I just sort of find perplexing in his entire story. It almost feels like we have these comparisons with Napoleon. It almost feels like Elba-esque, sort of the way he sort of feels about how things might pan out in
Well, I
comparison
mean,
to reality.
I mean, there is a through line that I can detect, whereby it seems as if, like I said, he's not fighting for the sake of conquest. If anything, Charles XII seems to be fighting for the sake of gaining unreliable allies. As ridiculous as that seems, he's fighting against Denmark and he gains an unreliable ally in the form of Britain. He fights against Saxony and gains an unreliable ally in the form of Poland. He fights against Russia in the hopes of gaining an unreliable ally in the form of the Cossacks and against the Ottoman Empire. And rather than renege on that strategy and focus on the new reality and do your duty as a king and defend your homeland, you are instead banking on this strategy, which has already been proven to have failed conclusively with proof. It doesn't matter how many intrigues you're
Time and again as well.
able to effect in this situation, you just linger on. And it is during this time, really 1713 to 1716 is the nadir for Sweden, because the War of Spanish Succession effectively, finally sort of winds up, and this means that Britain and France and the Netherlands are now focusing on the Great Northern War. They don't have the same mentality in terms of, oh, we must keep Sweden neutral to prevent her becoming a French ally. Well, not only is the War of Spanish Succession over and has France now made peace with Britain and Austria, but to make matters worse, in 1715, Louis XIV dies, and the whole trajectory of French foreign policy basically becomes that of internal consolidation. And in 1714, the Elector of Hanover, George I, becomes King of Great Britain. And what does this mean? He's going to use the power of Great Britain to expand his electorate of Hanover at the expense of Sweden. And so, what does, again, in terms of hoping to get unreliable allies, what does Charles do in response, Marcus? Charles supports the Jacobites.
Yes, exactly. Yeah,
he's
an alert for unreliable allies once again.
Yes, he's already done that with Poland with great success. Now he's doing that again with Britain with even less success.
Yeah, and you got to think too. This is this little nexus of Swedish power that you can sort of see here in the bottom left, the pink: Hanover, Hamburg, Altona. Sorry, just give me a second. Sorry, I just had to cough. This little sort of nexus of Swedish power in northern Germany, which is geographically even more isolated than the holdings that Sweden had in places like Wismar and Stralsund and Stettin. This is on the other side of the Jutland Peninsula, the other side of Denmark, which really the Swedes can't get to unless they march overland. And Britain hasn't been fighting in this war at all. They've had no dealings with Russia. They've had no. I mean, the British have been involved elsewhere. But the British are also are a more powerful entity. They have greater reserves and greater sort of economic might, a large population, and so them being able to absorb this territory is almost a cost-free adventure for them. Whereas for the for the Swedes, there's another hammer blow to their prestige, to their prospects. It's another loss of territory and of rather valuable territory. And it's just this yet another sort of domino that falls in this inexorable decline and dismantling of what we could call the Swedish Empire.
And as you know, the Prussians get in on the act as well. They do the same. If everyone else is carving out the Swedish Empire, why don't we attack Swedish Pomerania? And this leads to the great siege of Stralsund, which, in fairness to the Swedes, they do hold out for, 4 years, from 1711 to 1715. But nevertheless, Stralsund does eventually fall. And so, as I mentioned with my Heraclius example towards the beginning of the stream, this is his, the arrival of the Muslims. We have lost the Levant and we have lost Egypt. We have now lost the East and we have now lost Germany.
But Syria, what a fine province you'll be for the enemy,
Yes, exactly. But what is the consolation he has now? Things are going too well for the coalition. It is the fact that things go so well for the coalition that ends up giving him some respite, because the Germans and the British now witness the arrival of 40,000 Russians in Germany, and they now look at it basically as the beginning of the Great Game, you can say. They all look at Russia and say, this is the enemy we need to fight, and no longer the Swedes. The Russians have become too powerful. Peter the Great has become too successful. He's at risk, basically, of establishing his own Mare Nostrum within the Baltic Sea, which, of course, Russia is definitely aiming and aspiring to do. So it is from that moment in 1716 that the coalition finally begins to fall apart, as they're basically realizing that Russia is the greater threat to this. And it affords, for the first time during this war, Charles XII to come back to Sweden following the loss of Stralsund and to organize a new army. And he decides to focus his attempts in attacking Denmark. And this again sort of points back to my stuff of sort of a limited grand strategy, because it's only now that he's realizing that perhaps the conquest of Denmark would be a sound strategic decision in terms of being able to basically at least force Denmark out of the conflict while allowing the other powers to be brought over to Sweden by the fear of Russian gains and Russian power in the Baltic, in Finland. Again, Britain fearing sort of the maritime growth of Russia as a naval power for the first time, all of these things. But a later Swedish king, uh, Jean Bernadotte, is basically able to affect this belated strategy of Charles XII. And in that sense, I would say actually that Jean Bernadotte has had a far greater grasp of grand strategy than Charles XII ever did, because in one year, in 1814, Jean Bernadotte conquered the Kingdom of Norway. Norway, Denmark, by the way, had been basically in personal union for what, 600 years up until this point, 500 years. And in one
About that, yeah.
decisive, yes, in one decisive campaign, Jean Bernadotte conquers Norway, and Norway and Sweden remain as one kingdom for the next 100 years until Norway declares independence. I think it's in the year 1905. That one thing does more to secure the longevity of Sweden and also the dominance of Sweden vis-a-vis Denmark than anything Charles XII was able to achieve. And this is after having already lost Finland. And it should be mentioned that the king who lost Finland, King Gustav IV, was obsessed with Charles XII. And when he was deposed following the loss of Finland, he basically lent credence to this idea that Charles XII, when he was shot in Norway in 1718 and died, this wasn't a random sort of lucky sniper shot. Instead, it was a act of regicide. Gustav IV was falling to the same fate when he was deposed, and also his son was dispossessed. There is this grand romantic legacy, but ultimately, when it comes down to it, all I can say, the one sort of point I would give Charles XII is, had he lived longer, it is possible he may have been able to carry out this version of the Jean Bernadotte strategy much earlier than was ultimately achieved in 1814. And like I said, thanks to the success of the allotment system created by Charles XI, he was able to raise an army of 40,000 men from which to finally launch the full invasion of Norway. And it was due to the diplomatic situation in Europe that Sweden could have, again, gained that breathing space. So Sweden had survived. It would eventually be able to restore Finland. But if it had simply been a matter of the diplomatic, the lack of diplomatic grace from Charles XII, we've already explained basically what his diplomacy was, and it failed each time, but he tried to replicate the formula of finding unreliable allies wherever he could. But if it was so simple to find peace, if it simply came to the matter of having a monarch with a far more even-handed temperament, then when he was shot in 1718, you would have thought that would be enough to win the war, wouldn't you? But the war continued for 3 years. And in the end, there's a very obvious reason why hostilities were brought to a close. And it's nothing due to the fact that the Great Northern War had been fought for so long. When he died, there were two possible claimants to the throne of Sweden. One was his nephew, who was the Duke of Holstein. The other was his living sister, Ulrika. His older sister, Duchess Hedvig, had died, I think, around the same time of Poltava, which caused that double tragedy for Charles XII in 1809. But all of this is to say that it starts off a succession struggle. One faction is supporting Holstein. The other faction is supporting Ulrika's husband, who just so happens to be the Landgrave of Hesse. What this effectively means is that Hesse has an interest now being an ally with Sweden, and it has no interest in propping up Sweden's old ally Holstein. So basically, the new de facto king of Sweden, King Frederick I, the Landgrave of Hesse, decides, well, if Holstein's the sticking point, and Holstein also seems to be the source of the main rival to my power, give the Danes what they want. Give the Danes Holstein. And that is primarily the reason as to why the Swedes finally accepted a peace. That was the sticking point. Charles would not accept, but Frederick would accept, and he accepted purely for his own sound dynastic reasoning in the end. So there is something to say that, Charles doomed the Swedish Empire. I think, like I said, the fact that the coalition was tearing itself apart by 1716 and Britain was switching sides, etc., proves that had Charles lived longer, he may have been able to at least save some face for Sweden. The days of the empire were gone with Poltava, but he may have been able to save some face. And it was only the expendability of Holstein which allowed for peace to be achieved in the way that it did. And there's another criticism against Charles, which is that he basically expended all of the resources of Sweden, and essentially he nullified the effect of Swedish absolutism to the point that you see various coups in the course of the 18th century, most notably by King Gustav III, to bring back Swedish absolutism, but it had been the reckless and you can say irresponsible use of Swedish arms which caused absolutism in Sweden to become a spent force and ushered in the quote unquote age of liberty, which was really a cause briefly of parliamentary monarchy in Sweden. But the reason I say that's actually that story is actually overly simple, and I don't think it has that much sort of validity at all, is because the reason Swedish absolutism failed in the short term was because of the succession struggle, is because his sister, Ulrika, and her husband, Frederick, wanted the throne of Sweden for various reasons, and they didn't care about absolutism. They just wanted the throne. They wanted to see off the opportunity for Charles, Frederick, potential again, Charles XIII of Sweden, to inherit the throne. Arguably, he had a much better claim. And so they were prepared to grant massive concessions and basically unravel the legacy of Charles XI, who had spent so much time in limiting the Riksdag in terms of implementing the reductions, the table of ranks. All of that was basically reversed for the sake of this couple, the Landgrave of Hesse and the younger sister of Charles, to win the throne. And you may say again, oh, well, that's all Charles's fault. The same thing happened in Russia. Less people forget. The exact same thing happened in Russia. In 1730, Peter, the son of Peter the Great, died. And the nobles wanted to import a monarch who they could basically control and assert the rights of the Russian nobility vis-a-vis the quote-unquote autocracy of the Russian Tsars. So they import Anna, the Duchess of Courland. They basically believe she is so supine and weak that, she will come in and she will basically assent to all of our requests for gaining power. The only difference is with Anna and Ulrika is that Anna basically reneged on her agreement, but basically the exact same thing happened. In order for Anna to be offered the throne of Russia, she had to basically make the same settlement that Ulrika did. So, yeah, the end of the Swedish Empire, or what I call the dispelling of the mirage, as we can see, the whole sort of construct of Sweden as a great power was incredibly tenuous. There was a whole artificial transitory quality to it. It relied on incredibly competent, military prowess, and it required careful diplomacy. And in the case of Charles XII, as we can see, the reason I believe he failed, and the reason I believe that the whole notion of the Swedish Empire, or the whole notion of sort of its great power status, was illusory, is because he, as with the Swedish Empire, had no grand strategy. There wasn't, say, for example, this idea of conquering large parts of Russia to solidify the hold of Ingria and Livonia. The idea of the annexation of Courland from Poland, for example, was very mooted. There was no desire apart, for the conquest of, Danish territories until right at the end of the war, when Charles realized that the conquest of Norway would basically be enough to enforce a favorable situation in which Denmark could never go to war against Sweden again. But there is, we talk about the loss of Livonia, we talk about the loss of Ingria, the temporary loss of Finland. It should be mentioned that despite all of this, the ultimate peace treaty in 1721 wasn't that severe. Sorry, yes, Peter II, before I make a mistake, Peter the Great, his grandson, the Tsarevich Alexis, yes. Thank you, Brian Valco, for pointing that out. Yes, Peter II was the grandson of Peter the Great, not the son. Sorry, going back to my point, I've been distracted here. Marcus, can you follow the point? I've completely forgot. Oh, yes, I remember now. The ultimate peace treaty wasn't that severe Sweden was able to hold on to places like parts of Pomerania, really up until the Napoleonic Wars. So, yes, I think that's all I can really say about Charles XII and the end of the Swedish Empire.
Indeed. What's almost tragic is like a by point is a kind of like in the same way that when Napoleon comes out of Russia, was it from the Grand Army of hundreds of thousands, he barely marches back with, well, what was it, like, I think 80 or 60,000 men, whatever it was, and then that's sort of used as a core in which to half rebuild an army, which he then uses, the Battle of Leipzig, the so-called Battle of the Nations, but then he's also defeated there by the coalition, and then the survivors of that sort of trudge their way back to France, and there's another sort of 80, 90,000 men that have been drawn from yet another levée en masse, and it's the survivors of Leipzig and this sort of last levy that ends up being the constituent part with which Napoleon sort of, in this last sort of scurry of defensive battles, ends up halting the coalition, sort of, I mean, eventually the coalition to invade France, but a succession of brilliant defensive battles. Napoleon sort of gains himself enough of a bargaining chip, I suppose, sort of at least ensure he's exiled to Elba, and France isn't totally torn asunder by treaty. After the setbacks that he had on the continent, Sweden was able to send a relief army of 33,000 men, which obviously was then dwindled, on the way to rendezvous with Charles of Poltava there at Lesnaya, and then there's obviously the remainder of his army, which was obviously in Ukraine at the time, and then following that and following his few years in the Ottoman Empire, Sweden was able to raise another army of 40-odd thousand men in order to partake that invasion of Norway. And if you think about it, if those three constituent forces had been used differently, right? If Charles had rendezvoused or sent even a token force to Lesnaya, or himself marched on Lesnaya, he could have defeated that Russian army that was in pursuit. He might have marched out of Poland intact. He could have.
Well, just to emphasize that, Marcus, after the Battle of Holovytsin, the Tsar Peter made him a peace offer, which was he would give back all of the territories he had occupied, with the exception of St. Petersburg. Of course, that would have meant that Peter was essentially buying time from which to consolidate St. Petersburg. But I mean, the same thing happened in the Ottoman Empire, and it's why the Battle of Proof is actually quite significant, because Peter holds on to Azov. Azov is basically his one entrepot onto the Black Sea, and after the Battle of Proof, he gives it up again. So again, it's possible that Charles could have won back all of his conquests, with the exception of St. Petersburg, and all it would have taken would be one more decisive battle to regain St. Petersburg. And basically, Charles would have gained a great sort of conquest there, because so much money, investment, manpower had been used in basically giving Charles a free port on the Baltic Sea. So again, he was given
tens of thousands of battle-hardened men who were otherwise lost. Yeah,
exactly. So given that was the option that Charles was given after Holovytsin, what was he ultimately fighting for at Poltava?
Exactly, and that's where the idea of forlorn hope comes to rise.
Yes, there was no grand strategy, and that again betrays the point that there wasn't really a Swedish empire. Again, he was acting as if he was some sort of great sort of Hannibal-esque conquering hero. But Russia wasn't some intractable enemy like Rome that would ultimately, create a, Sweden Delander est. There was no such, historic grand enmity between the powers that one couldn't live while the other
There wasn't
survived.
there wasn't a Russian Scipio, yeah.
Yes, there wasn't a Russian. Well, in many ways, actually, there was. Peter the Great, you can say, as a Russian Scipio in many senses, but there
True.
wasn't the same drive as Rome, desired to destroy Carthage, with Russia desiring
Absolutely,
to
yeah.
attack Sweden. It was basically, okay, well, we have our control over, these Baltic provinces. Now we can leave you alone. Oh, we will nab
Yeah,
Finland later in 1809, but you have to wait another 100 years before that happens. So again, I just look at this
exactly.
and wonder, what was it all for? You can have all these grand romantic notions. You can bewitch all of Europe. You can have Dr. Johnson and Voltaire, writing these, poems and histories about you. You could be the inspiration for Frederick the Great. You could be the inspiration for Napoleon. And that leads me to my final sort of epilogue regarding this. Someone was saying Frederick the Great had no strategy. That's complete nonsense. Frederick the Great was one of the greatest strategic minds in the 18th century. And the reason I say he had a grand strategy in taking over Silesia, which was his great military victory and one that he was able to hold on to despite, the 7 Years' War, that allowed him to have an economic base and a manpower base from which to perpetually challenge the Austrian Empire, something from which they never recovered, and it was a permanent blow to their prestige. Later on, he was basically able to present himself as the champion of the smaller German princes. Basically, he was able to force a new situation in Germany, where for once there were two great powers and not simply one. And to confirm this, my belief is that Frederick the Great duped Russia and Austria into the partitions of Poland, because ultimately, Prussia was the main beneficiary from the partitions, because despite, again, the vast disparity between those three powers, Austria and Russia had so much more manpower and resources than Prussia. Prussia was able to get control of the Polish economy through the Vistula, and ultimately was able to gain the incredibly important port at Danzig. And indeed, in the first series of partitions of Poland, the Prussians were actually able to get Warsaw as well. So the Prussians did incredibly well, and it left Prussia with great power status, which is more than can be said for what Napoleon did with France and what Charles XII did with Sweden, which comes back to this point, which is Max Cataphract in the chat, who did more damage to their own empire. Napoleon, because Napoleon had an empire, Charles didn't have one, as I've been at pains to say. What Charles had is an imperial mirage. He had a formidable military legacy, and he had a formidable military reputation, which inflated Sweden's prestige and its diplomatic significance artificially during the height of the War of Spanish Succession. Like I said, the British were at pains to keep Sweden out of that conflict, lest they join in with the side of the French. Whereas if we look at what Napoleon did in 1812, Napoleon had the greatest empire in European history since Charlemagne, and he decided to throw it all away in the same way that Charles XII decided to throw everything away at Poltava. So Napoleon has far more blame than Charles XII has,
It's
because Napoleon lost
yeah,
so much more.
indeed. It's worth mentioning too that, and if there's a point of distinction between them, Napoleon had, and in some cases several times, managed to bring his enemies to their knees and extricate from them peace treaties, which were very favorable to France. You got to think he, at least on 3 or 4 occasions, has brought Austria to its knees, and without even having to take Vienna, had them sign quite humiliating treaties, and treaties which essentially ensured and you know uh, uh, guaranteed French supremacy, not just as a regional power, but almost as a world power. And the overrunning of Prussia in 1806 is much the same thing, where French hegemony is guaranteed and established by treaties which are imposed upon a defeated adversary. Charles never succeeds in this, except for the one campaign in Saxony, if I may say so. But even then, it was not really properly implemented. Yes, they ensured the indemnity was paid because he stationed his army in that one winter in Saxony. But in the end, Augustus technically was still leader of Austria, and then Charles tried to,
Of Saxony.
this is Saxony, um, but then Charles tries to. place Stanislav on the throne in Poland, Lithuania. That doesn't work, and he just never gets himself into a position where he successfully imposes a treaty on a defeated entity and knocks them out of a war. I think that is a key difference between them. Certainly that I notice.
Yes, I think that's fair. I mean, Charles's great success in Poland was in being able to get limited diplomatic recognition for a king who never had full control over Poland and Lithuania anyway, and was deposed almost immediately after Poltava. So yeah, no, Napoleon had so much more to lose than Charles ultimately did. And like I said, if Charles had lived a little longer and had he been able, I somehow I doubt he would have been, but had he actually been successful in at least making major inroads into Denmark, let alone the full conquest that Jean Bernadotte was able to achieve in 1814, he would have left Sweden in a much stronger strategic position against at least one of her, great enemies, i.e., Denmark. Whereas effectively what Napoleon was fighting in 1813 and 1814, it really becomes an academic point, because the longer he fought the campaigns, the more territory he was losing. In the case of Charles, I don't see that between 1716 and 1718. Like I said, Heraclius, had he died, in 1708, Sweden may have, been given over to the. That's also one caveat I need to point out. I mentioned the succession struggle, and I mentioned the fact that it is Frederick the Landgrave of Hesse who becomes the King of Sweden. Well, all of the Russian descendants of the House of Romanov are actually the descendants of Charles XI of Sweden through the Duke of Holstein, because that Duke of Holstein, who potentially could become King of Sweden, Charles Friedrich, was the father of Peter III, who was the common patrilineal ancestor to all of the remaining Romanovs. So that's one interesting connection there. That actually the Swedish royal family, they are the patrilineal ancestors to the Romanovs and not Peter the Great. That's perhaps one victory that Charles XII had over Peter the Great. What do you think of that,
Yeah.
Marcus?
No, I've nothing to. I wouldn't disagree in the slightest. I think you're on the
Right,
money.
okay. I'll just get through the super chats.
Mhm.
Shreved Goji for $10, thank you. Your work is most edifying and wonderful. Well, thank you. I cannot listen now. How does Sweden treat this era and the divine right absolutism of its kings? And will you continue Intrusible Chamber? I hope you do so. Well, absolutism, as I mentioned, I don't blame Charles XII for absolutism. Basically, it was temporarily lost to the Swedish kings because of the succession struggle. He absolutely has the share of the blame in terms of him deciding not to get married and have an heir. We've already discussed why he did that. So had the situation been different and had the succession been secure, it is likely that Swedish history could have been different. But like I said, Gustav III, he reintroduced absolutism. And Jean Bernadotte, he didn't introduce, you know, absolutism in the way, say, for example, that Charles XI had. But what Jean Bernadotte and the Bernadotte dynasty of Sweden did after, essentially, was they held reserve powers, which are effectively autocratic, all the way up until the 1970s, when, for some reason, the Swedish monarchy decided to relinquish those powers voluntarily. So the Swedish monarchy was relevant and powerful in a way that I would say no other European monarch really was after the First World War. To the point that, what was it, King Gustav or King Oscar of Sweden? I'm going to look it up. During the King of Sweden during World War II, Marcus.
I'm trying to think. Was that Gustav the Fifth or Fourth?
Yes, Gustav V. That's the one I'm
That's
thinking
right.
of.
Yeah. Yeah.
Had a profound influence on Swedish domestic and foreign policy during that time. So yes, interestingly enough, the legacy of Swedish absolutism lived on for a very long time. Um, as for how does Sweden treat this era, uh, again, for them, it is the last hurrah. in some senses. There is a new school of Caroline historiography, which again tries to paint this period in a more favorable light. I think there's a lot of historical revisionism going on right at the moment because of the links between Ukraine and Sweden and the advance of NATO, and the affinity of the Baltic states and their allegiance against Russia. You can obviously draw that connection to the geopolitical situation we're having now. In particular, Charles XII is a darling of like the far right in Sweden. Very much use far right in quotes, whatever we really mean by that. But I believe that my position that Charles XI was actually a better king of Sweden isn't very controversial. Yes, he wasn't as dramatic. Yes, he wasn't a tactical genius in the way that Charles XII was. But ultimately, he left Sweden far richer than he found it, and Charles XII left it worse. As for the intrusible chamber, yes, I have an idea of what to do. It's just the sort of the long sort of ladder of my interest. Effectively, it depends, which rung it's going to be on. Alex Roberts for $10. Thank you. It bothers me how my textbooks misrepresent or don't even touch on all the important stuff you've shared in these interviews. I'm very sorry to hear that, but I'm glad we've been able to rectify that situation to some extent. Ivan Grozny for, I'm not sure what currency that is, but thank you. Just got here. This is going to be interesting. As a Swede, this story is a real tragedy. Karl XII is both a nationalist hero and a catastrophic failure, but the analysis is often very one-dimensional. Well, hopefully, I mean, I think I've tried to offer a nuanced analysis, Marcus. I think we both have.
Mm-hmm.
We understand the appeal of him as a man, as a disciplined Christian, as a self-sacrificing soldier, as a Soldatenkönig archetype for, like I said, the various examples that we mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
He is iconic, but like I said, his legacy, just to summarize, his legacy was to dispel the myth that Sweden was a great power. He
Which
took
is
it
how
to
you
the
started the
absolute.
stream by saying that, yeah.
Yes, which is how I started the stream. That is basically it.
Mm.
Um, uh,
Just
Kaffer for, yep.
I was just going to say like SEK, Swedish krona, obviously. Yeah.
That's appropriate. I always find it funny that when we cover certain topics, all of the nationalities seem to pop out when it's appropriate.
Indeed.
So yes, all the Swedes are out in force today. Um, uh, Everdas Koffer for 100 Swedish krona. Thank you. I'm not sure how much that is, but thank you. Cheers and good night, AM and Furious, and thank you for this great stream about my childhood hero. Well, I mean,
Marvelous.
it's fine for you to have him as a secular hero. Like I said, as a man, there's a huge amount to admire about him. I admire a huge amount about him, but like I said, it was a wonderful assessment, really, in terms of the satire sort of put forward by Samuel Johnson at the beginning, in terms of the conflicted nature of his legacy. Yes, as a man, he was great in his own way, but like I said, as a strategist, he left a lot to be desired.
And the thing too, in terms of like admiring people, particularly if someone has an interest or an emphasis on say like military history or military leadership, as a concept, or dare I call it even as a uh, as like a hobbyist art form, is that there are very, very few, if not none, in history that are flawless. Like even though Alexander was undefeated, technically speaking, Alexander still made mistakes. Caesar had two setbacks, one at Dyrrhachium, one at Gergovia, was still an excellent leader of men and an exceptional general. Hannibal, arguably the greatest tactician of antiquity, lost the Battle of Zama and made his own errors. And this is also the case of someone like Charles XII, is that, yes, he had his deficiencies. Yes, he made mistakes. Yes, he made errors of calculation. But even so, even if, you are one is interested in military history and, is interested in the whole idea of, operations and tactics and that sort of stuff, you can still admire the man for the positive leadership qualities that he had, and you can even, to a large extent, admire his military aptitude despite his deficiencies and despite his errors. And when a person reads enough about, military leaders, you start to realize this is actually the true. It is actually true. you could look at any number of even like commanders of the modern age. You could compare Montgomery with Patton with Rommel, for instance, as three men who sort of faced off against each other, and each one will have their deficiencies and their advantages, or their strong points and their weak points, and you can still learn something from the study of them, and you can still admire them for their good qualities whilst recognizing the bad. It doesn't necessarily have to be that one throws the baby with the bathwater because this general made this mistake, or that general made that error, or this general lost this succession of battles or this war. It's a lot more nuanced than that.
And I find it funny that what we've uncovered during this stream, which again isn't actually something I've seen mentioned elsewhere, is Charles's diplomatic strategy, found on his idiosyncratic penchant for lost causes in other countries, whether it be Stanislaw Leszczynski, Ivan Mazeppa, or the Old Pretender in Great Britain. Always supporting the wrong side in every sort of enemy power. It's remarkable how that is how the conflict begins, and that is how the conflict ultimately ends. Marcus, so if we're going to talk,
you might call it a precursor and a portent at the same time.
yeah, if we're going to talk about inflexibility of strategy, that is one, but also maybe Charles is basically the original sort of color revolution supporter across all of these countries.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes,
The original State Department.
Yes, he's the original US State Department. All right, Marcus 588 for $3 Australian. Thank you. So, gents, when was the hinge point of his downfall? Well, Poltava, unmistakably.
I would say, personally speaking, he had to change course some point between. He would have had to change course sometime. We did touch on this. Sometime between his great victory at Holowitzen and Lesnaya. I'm of the belief of what I've read, because in the end I'm not particularly familiar with Charles XII. I mean, I did my research for this stream. Is that, had, for example, he had evacuated himself and rendezvoused with the relief army at Lesnaya, and had they bested the Russian force and defeated them, and then he marched back into friendly territory and won back Livonia, as an example, the course of the war would have gone very different. I think he probably would have retained a lot of his possessions. He arguably could have even re-campaigned into Ingria and, arguably kicked the Russians out of what do you call it, the southern Karelia, the isthmus around St. Petersburg and Vyborg. But he chose to go, he recklessly sort of picked up the dice and rolled them on the table once more, which is what Poltava was a desperate dice roll, and he lost everything, in essence. So for me, that hinge point lies between Holowitzen and Lesnaya, personally speaking.
Yes, and I agree with you. I mean, I mentioned Poltava. What I mean really is the whole strategy around Poltava.
Yes.
When your main enemy is defeated and massacred at Baturin, and your baggage trains are being intercepted, and you're barely getting any reinforcement, and you're besieging a random fortress, hundreds and hundreds of miles away from your main strategic objective, you may have to think, what am I doing? I'm just exposing myself and placing myself in a trap which is being carefully laid by my enemy.
Exactly.
It's rather remarkable, and again, just revealing that strategy, that he was basically trying to replicate a situation which worked with Denmark and worked with Saxony, and trying to replicate it into Russia. It just sort of boggles the mind, really.
And you got to think, in either case, Denmark and Saxony, he's not well, particularly Denmark, he's not far from home. You look at this map, Poltava and Stockholm are a long, long way from one another. And Poltava itself is not even on the periphery of Russian territory. It is relatively deep within southern Russia. And he's a long way from home, a long way from supply and reinforcement, with an army that is ragtag and tired. I mean, all of the factors, all the variables are very much against him, and yet he still chooses to be reckless. And there's a lot of generals in history that have been reckless. I mentioned, for example, Alexander, Caesar, Hannibal. They all did occasionally reckless things, but they were calculated risk. Whereas there was little prospect of victory at Poltava, and his likelihood of defeat was very great, and he had nothing spare. For instance, Sunnikas, he mentioned Caesar lost at Dyrrhachium. True, but Caesar kept his army intact, and he had other legions that were around Epirus and in Macedonia that could reinforce him, and he had a fallback position. Poltava was an all or nothing chance for Charles, with very little prospect of victory, yet he still did it to the utter, utter peril of his army and his kingdom. And
To
that
put
is what has to be determined.
to put this in perspective, Napoleon's invasion of Russia made far more strategic sense than Charles's invasion of Poltava. And the reason I say that is
100%.
Because Napoleon had the strength of numbers. What Napoleon did, he brought the largest army possibly in the world history up until that point, 600,000 men across the Niemen, and basically wanted a Borodino on his doorstep. That was his strategy. It was sound. He had nearly 3 times as much men as the Russians. The Russians obviously had the obvious strategy, well, we're not going to engage you, we're just going to retreat and retreat and retreat. He still got his Borodino. He still won. He still occupied Moscow. He underestimated the tenacity of his foe. In the case of Charles XII, it was basically he was defeated at the first hurdle. He didn't get anywhere near Moscow. So yes, Napoleon suffered from all the faults as Charles, but ultimately his ultimate strategy was sound. He just underestimated the Russians' tenacity.
And he also got drawn in too far, in a sense.
Yes, if you get to Smolensk and you still haven't engaged the Russians, you have to think, okay, well, maybe I'll just support some Lithuanian nationalists against the Russians and beef up my alliance with the Poles and maybe just call it a
Turn the
day.
Cossack, that sort of thing, yeah.
Yes, call it a day. But as with Charles XII, Charles XII didn't call it a day at Lesnaya in the same way, very, very close to Smolensk. Charles XII didn't call it a day at Lesnaya, and Napoleon didn't call it a day at Smolensk. Alec Massa, was grand strategy understood as we do today, or was it more nebulous in the 18th century? Well, all of these diplomatic ideas in some way originate from the late 17th and the 18th century. The idea of the great power really is from the 18th century. The whole dispossessed from the medieval notion of universal Christendom and the Holy Roman Emperor from Westphalia, the idea of political units basically being autonomous and having their own sort of strategic interests, which aren't motivated by things like religious concerns to the same extent. Yes, in the 30 Years' War, that's a major issue, but not so much of an issue afterwards. The whole notion of the balance of power became, the forefront, and the idea of the peace of Europe. All of these things were really coming to fruition around the 18th century. And of course, Frederick the great exponent of great power politics. Catherine of Russia, Catherine the Great of Russia, very much the same. And obviously we have Napoleon. So yes, if we are to understand it as a concept, it was really born in the 18th century. Do you think it's fair to say, Marcus?
I think so. The what I will say is that I think if you're talking about the actual genesis or the actual origin point of what we'd conceptualize as grand strategy, I think, and of course I want to be biased being a Byzantist, but what's interesting is that, and this is where someone like Edward Lutwyck is a very good author in this regard, is that compared to, say, the imperial Romans or even the Rome of the Republic, is they march out, they decisively defeat an enemy, they will suffer, God knows how many casualties, and they will suffer whatever setbacks, but Rome will grind out a victory however long it takes against whatever enemy at whatever odds. Whereas the Byzantines, having lost the western half of the empire and having more enemies and less defensible borders, had to be more, you might say, circumspect about how they fought, and having a greater and more comprehensive understanding of their enemies. And you look at the military manuals that are written, the Strategicon, Tatikia, several of these manuals that are written in sort of like the so-called like late Dark Age period into the early medieval period. And the fact that the Byzantines really had one of the first conceptions of what you call like diplomatic and military intelligence, and would have like spy networks, and would use embassies and emissaries and even missionaries to sort of collect information about their adversaries, to the point that someone like Constantine Porphyrogenitus writes a book, De Imperio Ministrando, which discusses all of the peoples and powers that surround the empire. That's probably like the genesis of grand strategy as we would understand it. But I do agree with AM in that so far that you've got this sort of post Scharnhorst and Eisenhower Clausewitz sort of era that follows the defeat of Prussia in the French Prussian War of 1806, where there's a very modern understanding of grand strategy. It's defined, and it's specifically in Vom Krieg, Clausewitz's writing on war, where he sort of defines aspects of what comprises grand strategy and what a nation ought to do in order to ensure that they prevail in the game of grand strategy, and the factors of the military aspects, the diplomatic aspects, the economic aspects of war that constitute a country engaging in grand strategy successfully. So I think if you take those two examples, you'll have a fairly well-rounded understanding of how grand strategy has been developed as a concept, and how people in those times would have understood it for themselves.
And given that the whole notion of grand strategy was really, the crux of my argumentation here, I think it's only appropriate that we've rounded off with your assessment there, Marcus. So is there anything you want to say before we get out of here?
The only thing I will mention, because I just had a massive mental blank at the start of the stream, I mentioned about in the 30 Years' War, there was that Habsburg general that was killed. It was von Mercy. It was the Second Battle of Nördlingen, where he sort of made a proclamation about like finally besting Turenne and Grand Conde, and struck by cannonball moments later. One of the sort of instances of providence. Sometimes it's with you, sometimes it's against you. And I just couldn't remember who it was, because with the 30 Years' War, it's usually, in terms of the protagonists on the Habsburg side, it's usually Wallenstein or Tilly or von Mercy, and the person I just couldn't think of was von Mercy at Nordlingen. That is an aside regarding the stream here. I just want to say that I actually found Charles XII very interesting to read about and to research, and I can understand that for Sweden why Charles, probably more Charles XI in terms of setting up the kingdom as he did, Charles XII for his military exploits, and Gustavus Adolphus. I can completely understand why Swedes hold them in the highest of regard, and for the relatively short zenith that this nation had at that in that time period, in that era, they make for interesting reading, and even like from a military standpoint, the Carolian army is a wondrous sort of unless it doesn't get the attention that say like the Legionnaires do, or the Crusader period, or the Prussian Grenadiers or Napoleon's army. It sort of sits on like another tier that doesn't quite get the attention it deserves. But the Carolian army of Charles XI, Charles XII, to some degree even of Gustavus Adolphus, is a phenomenal military machine, and it is very interesting from a historical standpoint. It's interesting from like a military tactics standpoint, and it is a pity it doesn't get more attention in our spheres, because I mean it really does deserve it. And I have to say I thoroughly enjoyed the topic, and I'm glad we managed to renew our partnership on these streams on such an interesting topic.
All right. Thank you, Marcus. Okay. Thank you for everyone who sent super chats, and thank you for joining us for this stream. Good night.
Good night.